Welcome, Excellencies. Welcome all participants online and in person. Thank you very much for joining this meeting, this very important meeting. Before I give the floor to the panelists of the opening segment, I would like to remind some ground rules that were sent to you in the logistics note, but just as a reminder. The plenary sessions of today's meeting will be held in English only. You will have received information on how to activate captioned translation through WebEx. It's at the bottom of this of your screen, on the left-hand side of your screen. We are sorry for not being able to provide interpretation in other languages. As you know, the United Nations Secretariat is facing an acute liquidity crisis. As mitigation measure, the breakout sessions, which will follow the panel discussions, will be organized per language. There will be 3 breakouts, 1 breakout in English, 1 in French, and 1 in Spanish online. And in the room, we will have also group work, group discussions per language to really facilitate interaction. For participants attending in person, the meeting room is equipped with microphones that are on the ceiling, and they are very sensitive. And they capture all sounds, including coffee, like drinking, anything that you're typing. It's quite sensitive, but this also allows for participation throughout the room with the screen, with people remotely. So this is, great technology, but it has also side effects. Therefore, to maintain clear audio quality for all participants, we kindly ask you to minimize unnecessary noise and avoid speaking when not addressing the meeting. When you are in the room, please mute your microphone and speaker of your computer when joining the meeting using your mobile phone or computer. For optimal audio quality, it is imperative that only 1 participant speaks at a time. Remote participants who wish to take the floor can press on the raise hand button. In-person participants can put their nameplates vertically to request for the floor. Remote participants can also interact via the chat and the Q&A option. Without further ado, I will give the floor to our first opening speaker, Ms. Nosy Ramamon-Gissoa, from the Capacity Building Program, coordinator of the Capacity Building Program of OHCHR. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay. Colleagues, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to join Marie-Ève in welcoming you to this event, those that are in the room but also online. My name is Nosy Ramamon-Gissoa. I'm the coordinator for OHCHR's Capacity Building Program on the Human Rights Treaty. And I'd like to acknowledge the organization that co-organized this event with us, which is Global City Hub, the Geneva Human Rights Platform, and UCLG, United Cities and Local Government. So allow me also to say a couple of words on the program that I'm coordinating. So it has a global mandate to support states in meeting their treaties obligations. So we provide support to states from ratification of human rights treaties, engagement with the bodies that monitor the implementation of these treaties, so the UN treaty bodies, and more largely with the UN mechanisms. And also we support states in the implementation of the recommendation from this mechanism. And we also work with civil society organizations, national human rights institutions, in their engagement with the international human rights nations. And part of the support that we provide into states is the establishment and the strengthening of government structures effectively coordinate at the national level the engagement with the international human rights system.
Speak slowly, please.
All right. Okay, thank you. I'll do that. So these are the so-called national mechanisms for implementation, reporting, and follow-up, or NMIRF. And I'd like to highlight 3 things about this mechanism. So these are national governmental structures, not independent bodies, and they represent the duty bearer, that is the state as a whole, even if they're usually or they're always embedded in the government that is executive. And their main role is to coordinate how the states refer to and follow upon the recommendations from the United Nations treaty bodies, also the regional human rights mechanism for that matters, actually. The second point I'd like to make is that the establishment of these NMIRFs, the National Mechanism for Implementation, Reporting and Follow-up, is a practice that was initiated by states to streamline the national process for human rights reporting and implementation. And the third point, we've seen a steady increase in the number of states that have started establishing such mechanisms. And the role of OHCHR and this program is to document practices and make them available to others through workshops, seminars, or other platforms for peer learning or exchange of experience like today's event. So through that work, we've also seen that federal system and others evolved governance structures bring unique challenges and opportunities. And these realities call for particular attention. And that's why we felt it was important to create this space to exchange experiences on both what works and where difficulties. And ultimately, engagement with the UN or the regional human rights system requires coordination across all parts of the state and consultations with independent actors. And this would ensure that human rights reports and implementation take into consideration and reflect the realities experienced throughout the entire state, and not just the perspective of the central government. Coordination is needed across all parts of the state between the central governments, the legislative and judicial branches, across all levels, national, regional, and local. And given all these questions, today's seminar will look into engagement more generally of local and regional governments with international regional human rights systems in all sorts of country contexts, and how national frameworks can better reflect this diversity when it comes to human rights reporting and implementation. So with that, I welcome you all again and encourage you to be solutions-oriented in the conversation today, to be creative and constructive. And let's keep the focus on coordination at all levels and how it can be enhanced to further promote a human rights-based approach to governance and help us move closer to realizing human rights for everyone everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these introductory remarks that set the scene of this meeting today. I now give the floor to Ms. Antu Jeong, co-director of the Global Cities Hub. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Maria, and good morning, all colleagues. Good morning, city representatives, regions representatives. It's really a pleasure to be here today. Just a few words about us, since I'm not sure everyone knows the Global Cities Hub. We are an organization that pursues two objectives. One is to connect cities and regions to international processes and organizations. And to give you a very concrete example, we've done so through various entry points that we've been looking for, cities and region at the international level. For instance, we've been trying to connect cities and regions to the work of the Human Rights Council through state negotiated resolution, through participation in events, through research as well. We've been working with the Geneva Human Rights Platform here with the University of Bologna on this publication. So, policy work. So the first objective is really to connect cities and regions to international processes and organization. And the second one is to promote the urban on the agenda of the international community, because we all know our future is urban. So this is who we are and the reason why we've connected with OHCHR and other partners in co-organizing this event. I think when talking about the engagement of local and regional governments, it's important to distinguish two levels. One is the international level, where cities and regions can, participate in international events, do advocacy through international city networks or directly themselves. And to also focus the national level, where basically local and regional governments can, through their own state, through their own national administration, participate to the work of the international human rights system through those famous NMIRFs, I call them, or NMIRF, or for instance, with the support of national human rights institutions. So it's important to keep those two levels in mind when we talk. I think today we'll mainly look at the national level, how to basically ensure that coordination, ensure enhanced consultation between national level and the subnational level. As we all do, I think, at the Global Cities Hub, we believe that local and regional role in implementing human rights on the ground, in cities and regions where we live, we work, we study, we connect, we play, we move around. We heard it yesterday, actually. Local and regional governments are absolutely fundamental to implement and protect and respect human rights in our daily life. However, a very limited fraction of that human rights work on the ground is being captured by the international system, which focuses almost exclusively on the national level, and therefore basically interacting with states only. So the question today is, would those NMIRF and NMIRF be a good vehicle to capture input from local and regional governments? When those bodies exist, are they sufficiently flexible, sufficiently inclusive to do so? If yes, what has been the experiences so far in your respective countries? If not, should we consider alternative bodies, vehicles for local and regional governments to provide input into the international human rights system? So we're looking very much forward to discussing that issue with you today. Maybe another topic that should also be addressed, or at least kept in mind today, is how we may link up human rights with sustainable development goals, so as to facilitate local and regional governments with the international human rights system, in particular when it comes to human rights reporting. At the Global Cities Hub, our experience has been that local and regional government were not always interested to engage in very human rights legalistic discourse that tend to prevail at the international level. They are mainly driven by practical governance consideration, mainly how do I provide public service in my own territory? And so we need to take this into account when we're looking at ways and means to enhance the engagement of local and regional governments into the international human rights system. So to conclude, I really hope that today, as an outcome of this event, we'll be able to find ways to better capture that very important human rights contribution of local and regional governments, again, be it through these NMIRFs or otherwise, that we'll be able to better link up human rights and SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, so as to facilitate the input of local and regional governments into reporting, but also implementation. And I think overall, I'd like to get much stronger arguments for local and regional governments to better engage with the international human rights system, but with international human rights law in general. We all know there's a cost associated to that engagement. We need expertise, capacities, resources to engage meaningfully. But we need to show that over the long term, there's a benefit to that engagement. Benefit in the sense that this should allow your city, your region to better understand where you stand in comparison to others, where are the gaps, where are the opportunities, where you should invest to ensure better quality of life for your residents. And this should allow you to hold your own national government to account vis-a-vis its own international human rights commitments. So these are benefits. I hope, we'll hear about them during the discussion today. And I'm very much looking forward to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Antu, for again really emphasizing on the importance for member states as a whole to involve local and regional governments to really represent the human rights situation on the ground. I'll now give the floor to Dr. Domenico Zipoli from the Geneva Human Rights Platform of the Geneva Academy. You have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Maria. Good morning to you all, excellencies, mayors, representatives of local and regional governments, colleagues, and distinguished participants. It's a great pleasure to join you this morning. My name is Domenico Zipoli. I coordinate the work of the Geneva Human Rights Platform of the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights. What we do is, in a nutshell, to provide a neutral academic space to connect to Geneva-based human rights mechanisms with regional, national, and more so local actors throughout our activities, supporting more coherent, participatory, and data-driven human rights implementation. Felix Kirchmeier, the Geneva Human Rights Platform's executive director, also brings his wishes today as he could not be with us. However, we're especially glad to have with us today two distinguished members of the Geneva Human Rights Platform's advisory board, Virginia Brash-Gomes and Milun Kotari, who will help us unpack this complex, beautiful relationship between national mechanisms for implementation, reporting, and follow-up, and local and regional governments. Now, risking repeating a few things that have already been said, I'd like to start off by highlighting one persistent gap, and that is that while local and regional governments play a central role in realizing human rights on the ground, sometimes not identified as such, only a limited fraction of this work is currently reflected in the international human rights system. And this, in a way, undermines the accuracy, the legitimacy, and the utility of state reporting. So this is really the crux of the matter, at least from our perspective, that we wish to discuss. So, a first key question, which I guess is really the fil rouge of what we'll be discussing today, is how can national mechanisms for implementation of reporting serve as an institutional entry point to better capture and coordinate local and regional governments' contributions? I've used the words can or how. We should also think of whether NMIRFs are the correct institutional entry point. We think that their strategic location, so NMIRF's strategic location between the international and domestic spheres, and their mandate to coordinate both reporting and implementation, make them at least a promising vehicle to do just that. A second point that I'm, repeating from what Antu just mentioned, lies in bridging the human rights and SDG agendas. Many local governments, as you know more than I do, are already engaging in SDG localization through BLRs, for instance, so collecting data, planning policies, and evaluating results. And by mapping human rights recommendation, international human rights recommendations against SDG targets, we can create shared frameworks that enable local and regional governments to report once, perhaps, but to use data twice. Both for national human rights reporting and for SDG tracking. And in a way, if done well, this approach might lower the reporting burden while expanding engagement and ownership. The third and last point that I'd like to mention is one key message from the Academy briefing that we have discussed also briefly yesterday on localizing multilateralism. This publication, which contains the findings from the Bologna Expert Roundtable on Data Planning and Collection by NMIRFs, the role of local regional governments and national statistical systems, so very much in line with what we're discussing today. This Expert Roundtable was organized by the University of Bologna's Department of Legal Studies, the Global Cities Hub, and Italy's NMIRFs, the Interministerial Committee on Human Rights. What this publication essentially calls for is for LRGs to be recognized as co-owners of the human rights monitoring cycle. As I already said, producing localized data, connecting recommendations to SDG targets, translating commitments into local action, and essentially allowing for participatory follow-up. And one key enabler of this vision, it's something that I already mentioned yesterday, we think is digital information management. There are tools out there that are already existing, such as the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights National Recommendation Tracking Database, CMORE Plus, Impact OSS, that are transforming how human rights data is collected and used, mapping essentially the life cycle of recommendations, identifying responsible actors, analyzing patterns, increasingly with artificial intelligence and machine learning support. We have a directory of tools, of such tools, on the Geneva Human Rights Platform website that I invite you to look at. And these platforms may offer a practical way to embed local and regional governments in national human rights data systems. in such way making reporting more inclusive, granular and grounded in local realities. Essentially granting access to local and regional governments themselves, or perhaps the umbrella bodies within these broader data systems. Yes, we're confident today that today's discussions will lead us toward clear and concrete recommendations. It'd be great to come out of today with a number of forward-looking recommendations and ideas and suggestions for how NMIRFs can facilitate LRG participation, for how digital innovation can support that goal, and ultimately for how we can make multilateral human rights processes more locally rooted and universally relevant. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zipoli, for your introductory remarks. Given that time is of the essence and that we are already 10:23, by the way, I am Swiss, so I will really be trying to be a good time manager. We declare this event open, and I invite the panelists of panel 1 and the moderator of panel 1, Ms. Virginia Braz-Gomez, board member of the Geneva Human Rights Platform and former chair of the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, to join me in the main panel table. Please, Mr. Joachim Ricard, you can sit on my right-hand side, or left-hand side, as you wish. And we have the pleasure of having the third panelist online. So Ms. Young-Mi Cho, Deputy Director of Trans Education at the Peace Institute of Peace Momo, Republic of Korea, is online. And we will be giving you the floor after the other two panelists. I now hand the floor to Ms. Virginia Braz-Gomez, who will moderate panel 1. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marie-Eve, and good morning to all of you. I am not Swiss, but I will also try to be rather strong on the time management. I welcome you all again today, and I think the opening remarks have set the tone for what we need to do today. So, the process of making NMIRFs a regular component of the national human rights system has moved relatively fast over the last few years due to the will of states at national and international levels. It is indeed a positive sign that many states dealing with a chronic lack of funding and material resources to comply with their human rights reporting and monitoring obligations have chosen to establish and strengthen NMIRFs to decrease or even eliminate reporting backlog and ensure better implementation of recommendations by the treaty bodies, UPR, special procedures and other mandate holders, and also in promoting the SDGs. Because the decentralization of the functions of governments and because of the LRG proximity, and when we use the term LRG here, I think we're using the broader notion of LRG, whether we're talking of cities, other structures at local, subnational, regional levels. LRGs is probably at all designation. So because of their proximity to the lived realities of individuals, groups, and communities, and their grounded understanding of the challenges to the realization of human rights, in particular of economic, social, and cultural rights, LRGs are key implementation actors that has already been spoken of this morning. They can provide evidence on the pace and extent of progressive realization, for example, of the rights to health, education, water and sanitation, but perhaps more importantly, on how fundamental human rights principles such as non-discrimination and equality, participation and accountability are being fulfilled at ground level. While we all agree that there is no one size fits all, it would be fair to say that in general, NMIRFs have been instrumental in increasing policy coordination and coherence at national level. However, there's little evidence that the engagement with NRGs has advanced at a steady pace. And this means that a key player in the realization of human rights is not fully in the picture. So in this first session, we will discuss concrete and practical ways and means to foster the engagement of LRGs with the international human rights system, with a particular focus on the role of NMIRFs. And we will do so with the initial presentations of our three distinguished panelists, to whom I'm very happy to give the floor, and I would be grateful if you could respect the time management issues. The first is Ian Brown, Senior Policy Analyst and Advisor, Department of Canadian Heritage, Canada. Mr. Brown, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the OHCHR for the invitation to participate in the seminar today and to participate in this morning's panel. We see this as a key opportunity for Canada to further communicate how our NMIRF is structured and functions under our federal context, as well as an opportunity to learn from the experience of others with their NMIRFs. During its fourth Universal Periodic Review in 2023, Canada received recommendations to create an NMIRF within our government. The term was relatively new in the UN system and for Canada, but Canada recognized it already has long-established mechanisms in place that form part of what an NMIRF should constitute. Since 2023, Canada has therefore been working to further define the elements of our own NMIRF, taking a humble and open-minded approach to learning from best practices from other UN member states, especially other federal states, to ensure Canada's mechanism is as meaningful as possible. We continue to engage with an active group of human rights stakeholders in Canada who have views on Canada's NMIRF and who have regularly called on Canada to improve it. We remain open to these views as well. As a federal state where responsibility for different policy areas relevant to human rights lies outside of the federal government, implementation of human rights obligations in Canada is a shared responsibility between the federal government and 13 provincial and territorial or subnational governments. Our NMIRF is comprised of focal points from the national and subnational governments who work with a broad network of subject matter experts responsible for policies, laws, and programs that serve to implement those rights. By supporting accountability processes such as reporting and follow-up, the ultimate objective of our NMIRF is to contribute to the improvement of human rights implementation in Canada. In Canada, the NMIRF is comprised of 4 different mechanisms which are independent but interconnected and taken together contribute to the functioning of the NMIRF. These are a secretariat housed within the Federal Department of Canadian Heritage, a standing intergovernmental federal, provincial, and territorial, or what we call FPT, table on human rights and its 3 committees, one which dates back to 1975 and the other 2 being more recent to provide guidance at more senior levels, including at the ministerial level. 3, a federal interdepartmental coordination mechanism, and 4 interdepartmental mechanisms which within individual provincial and territorial governments. Given limited time, and I will speed up, I will focus the remainder of my presentation on the role of the Secretariat. The Secretariat of Canada's NMIRF is housed within the Human Rights Program at the Federal Department of Canadian Heritage and is staffed by a dedicated team. The Secretariat's functions include leading coordination of Canada's FPT reporting and appearances before UN human rights bodies for 7 core treaties and the UPR, managing the FPT table on human rights and its key bodies to support collaboration across governments on human rights accountability processes such as reporting and reviews. This FPT table is co-chaired by Canadian Heritage as the Secretariat for the NMIRF and a rotating co-chair at the provincial territorial level, currently held by the province of Saskatchewan. Within the federal government, we also have a federal human rights implementation framework, which focuses on 3 pillars: awareness, collaboration, and accountability. This includes interdepartmental coordination through, for instance, the Directors General Forum on Human Rights. While respecting the autonomy of each jurisdiction, the FPT table fulfills its mandate through facilitating preparation of reports and reviews before treaty bodies in the UPR and follow-up from these processes, sharing information and best practices on implementation, enabling consultation between governments with respect to Canada's adherence to international human rights treaties, and engaging with Indigenous peoples, civil society organizations, and human rights commissions. In 2020, ministers from almost every subnational jurisdiction and the national government endorsed two key documents that have helped guide intergovernmental collaboration on international human rights obligations: the Protocol for Follow-up to Recommendations by International Human Rights Bodies and the Engagement Strategy on Canada's International Human Rights Reporting. The FPT table is therefore the primary mechanism through which the Government of Canada works with subnational governments. While I won't be able to go into detail about some of the specific mechanisms within subnational governments, provincial and territorial governments have their own respective human rights mechanisms for coordinating information on Canada's reports and reviews and to follow up on recommendations through these processes. So what's next? Today represents an important opportunity for Canada to better tell our story in terms of the components and work of our NMIRF. We continue to work with members of civil society and other stakeholders, including Indigenous representatives, to ensure they are aware of the various components of our NMIRF and which jurisdiction is responsible for implementation on a particular human rights policy area. As mentioned at the beginning, we are approaching our work as the Secretariat of the NMIRF with humility and welcome the opportunity to continue to learn from those of you in the room and around the world who have seen progress through your work within your NMIRFs. We also continue to explore the use of tools to assist in the coordination of follow-up on recommendations received from UN treaty bodies. We are most grateful for our ongoing collaboration with the OHCHR as we continue to work on the possibility of using the NRTD for this work. So thank you again for this opportunity to present, and we hope this is the first in many events where Canada can tell its story about human rights implementation and learn from others working in this important space.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you very much. I think you've highlighted some of the difficulties of what an NMIRF could look like in a federal context. And when you speak of national, provincial, and territorial obligations, it is something that countries that do not have this political model really are not very much aware of. But it's good to know that you have one aspect which is a key aspect in any NMIRF, which is a broad representation and a strong participatory approach. And we look forward to hearing some more about the ongoing efforts of Canada. I now give the floor to Mr. Joachim Rucker, who wears a double hat. He is a former mayor and the former president of the Human Rights Council. Welcome, Mr. Rucker. You have the floor.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this conference and this very distinguished panel. Indeed, I think I owe this invitation to my dual street credibility here and as a mayor of an industrial city called Sindelfingen for almost a decade. Now, here are some remarks from the German perspective. Germany does not have an all-encompassing integrated NMIRF type system, including a database and a follow-up mechanism for its national reporting to the UN human rights system. At least it doesn't have it yet. This applies to both relevant dimensions, reporting under the UPR, treaty bodies and other obligations, and reporting with regard to the three main layers of government: federal, state, and local in our case. And if at this conference we can learn more about best practices regarding an all-encompassing system, e.g. from Canada, that would be great. I understand that also Portugal has a good system, at least that's what I learned from our National Human Rights Institution. And I also understand that there might be different approaches to the same goal of integrating the local experience and practices. A recent conference in Liverpool in June stressed the pivotal role of national human rights action planning when including cities in human rights reporting. In any case, in Germany, data for the different reports are compiled by the federal government. Federal government includes data from states and local governments in a more or less systematic manner. This is notwithstanding the parallel reports from our National Human Rights Institution. As you well know, Germany is also the subject to reporting obligations with regard to the Council of Europe and the European Convention on Human Rights and the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the EU. Here, local governments and regions are part of the institutional setup as they articulate their positions on human rights issues, not only through federal channels, but directly in the relevant bodies, in the COE, that's the Congress of Local and Regional Authorities, and in the EU, that's the Committee of the Regions. So they have ownership and can articulate their activities directly in these frameworks. As regards the role of German cities with regard to the UN human rights system and the European systems, and regardless of how systematic cities are included in the national reporting system, it is safe to say that in many respects, cities are addressing human rights violations and risks in a most proactive manner. With regard to our latest UPR, which was from 2023, the German Institute for Human Rights recommends that policymakers prioritize measures to prevent child poverty, combat racism and anti-Semitism, present a strategy for protecting women from violence, take action to improve protections against homelessness, and very importantly, safeguard the fundamental rights of refugees and guarantee inclusive education. In addition, these days, it's very important to combat all forms of right-wing extremism, organized or not. And almost all of these challenges must be addressed at the local level. And our cities are very active, and there are many excellent collective and individual practices in this regard. In this context, you might want to note that in Germany, the competencies of city governments are quite substantial, and competencies of mayors. Inter alia, they are elected, at least in most federal states, directly. So that gives them a special role with regard to the city council as chair of the city council and as chief executive CEO at the same time. Back to the practices. You know that Global Cities Hub very well. This is one of the organizers with their activities. Well known to you is probably also the movement of human rights cities, where more and more German cities are joining. And according to Amnesty International Germany, the activities of the city of Sindelfingen, where I've been mayor, but the credit for more recent activities goes to my successor, is exemplary. Well known to you is also the network UCLG, which was mentioned before, with their explicit agenda for human rights, which has a growing number of members in Germany. You might also have heard about the Human Rights City Nuremberg and other more specific examples. However, and as stated, when it comes to systematizing German reporting through the UN human rights system, there is room for improvement. At this point, I do not want to go into the details of an improved reporting mechanism and structure for all layers of government. We've heard how this might or could function, starting maybe with a joint database, as for example specified in the OHCHR's NMIRF booklet. I find that very helpful. But I do think we also have to be innovative when it comes to what could be seen as technicalities. For example, and this has been mentioned before, I can only stress it might be a good idea to use some of the existing SDG reporting structures, including monitoring in cities, and use that for human rights as well. You refer to it as a shared format. I know, for example, that the city of Stuttgart, where I live, has an elaborate SDG reporting structure. As we all know, human rights are somewhat hidden in Goal 16, but we could maybe use that when moving forward in the reporting system, because there is also a tendency, which I do not have to remind you of, we're all well aware of it, the tendency to make our city administrations somewhat leaner and more user-friendly and maybe more cost-efficient. And if we're adding, for all the right reasons, something new, we might do this in the most effective and efficient manner. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Rupert. Thank you very much. Germany, of course, as you say, still does not have a fully fledged NMIRF, but I don't know if many countries have a fully fledged NMIRF. I think we all at different stages of development, and I can tell you about the Portuguese NMIRF too. We are at a different stage of development maybe, but there's a long way to go. So we welcome your comments, and I also highlighted the fact that you mentioned that cities address violations in a proactive manner. And I think that's something which we sometimes do not highlight enough, the role of LRGs in identifying violations and in promoting support for the victims. And thank you very much for that. And of course, you have to be innovative. Yes, I think we're all aware of that. And that is what we're looking forward in the dialogue and in the contributions after the panelists, to look for concrete, innovative ways to push this agenda further. And now I give the floor to the third speaker, is Ms. Yumi Sho. She is the Deputy Director of Trans Education at the Peace Institute of East Momo, Korea. And she's presently involved, or she's leading a research project exactly on engaging LRGs with international mechanisms. Ms. Cho, welcome. And I give you the floor.
And you can unmute yourself. I think you did it already. Thank you very much.
Hello, thank you for your kind introduction. Can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes. Thank you very much for inviting me. Currently, I lead a research project commissioned by the National Human Rights Commission of Korea on how local governments can better engage with the UN human rights mechanisms. This builds on last year's study on strengthening Korea's national mechanism for implementation, reporting, and follow-up. I thank the National Human Rights Commission of Korea and many of you here for your contributions to that work. Last year's research would not have been possible without the insights and contributions of many of you here today. The OHCHR guidelines, along with the publications by the Universal Rights Group, the Global Cities Hub, the Geneva Human Rights Platform, and the Danish Institute for Human Rights, provided invaluable references, and country-specific case studies offered meaningful comparative insights. And given the last year's report spanned over 270 pages in Korean, so I'd like to briefly highlight several key findings and proposals, particularly as they related to NMIRF and local governments. So although this has not been implemented yet, but it is planned to be realized based on the research results. And first, local governments as a core actors, NMIRF must be beyond reporting writing, and they must coordinate implementation, monitoring involving local governments that are on the front line of human rights in daily life. We recommended clear linkages between UN recommendations and national policies like the National Action Plan, local human rights action plans, and strategic plans of ministries. Human rights must be implemented not only nationally, but also locally and practically. And secondly, legislative bodies must be engaged in this process. The National Assembly and local councils should have an institutional role in Korea human rights reporting and implementation. Some countries do this already. In fact, I'm currently conducting a supplementary study with the National Assembly member to examine how the legislature can more effectively engage in human rights implementation. At the local level, governments must reflect UN recommendations in law, policies, and budget. And third, and establishing a permanent NMIRF. Korea currently uses an ad hoc inter-ministerial coordination structures. This is neither sustainable nor systematic. So we propose creating a standing NMIRF under the Prime Minister or the President, supported by a dedicated secretariat, seconded officers from key ministries, and official budget as well. This body should handle coordination, consultation, reporting, and follow-up across all levels of government, including local authorities. And fourth, digital tools for coordination. We recommended developing a digital human rights tracking tool that links ministries, parliament, statistic offices, the National Human Rights Commission of Korea, local government, and civil society. We may know the Paraguay and Mexico Similar Plus and Malaysia National Recommendation Tracking Database offers valuable models. These allow real-time, transparent monitoring and inclusive stakeholders participation. So Korea's current system developed by the National Human Rights Commission of Korea is a good start, but lacks public-facing features and interactivity. So we recommend enhancing it to be transparent, user-friendly, and participatory. And the fifth, the role of the National Human Rights Commission of Korea. The National Human Rights Commission of Korea should coordinate across the central and local levels and publish progress report. To do this, we propose strengthening what we call the 4 core NMIRF capacities, coordination across ministries, local governments, and civil society, and consultation through inclusive stakeholder dialogues, and information management, collecting, analyzing, sharing data effectively, and participation, enabling local actors to engage actively. To do so effectively, the National Human Rights Commission of Korea should strengthen the following 4 core NMIRF capacities, providing capacity building education based on the NMIRF capacities that are coordination capacities and consultation capacities, information management capacity, and the participation capacity for local officers and lawmakers, supporting the integration of human rights into local government frameworks. And strengthening the local human rights systems. Korea local human rights framework includes both structural components, for instance, ordinances, human rights offices, and ombudsman systems, and functional elements, the action plan, education, indicators, impact assessment. But Korea has made it progressive, but only about half of local governments have human rights audiences, and many of which are merely symbolic. So we recommended stronger law that guarantee rights for marginalized groups backed by the real budgets and institutions. In the last year's research, we found that local human rights systems that are more resilient when there is a transparent decision-making and strong participation and multi-stakeholder collaboration, even during local political transitions. This year, we are validating these findings with quantitative data. And legal framework needed. Finally, we recommended enacting a Human Rights Policy Framework Act in Korea. There is currently no legal basis for NMIRF operation, mandatory reporting, or local implementation. Such a law should require the development of a national action plan, define UN recommendation follow-up mechanism, mandate reporting duties for local governments, and ensure access to human rights education and data. I want to thank everyone contributing to this wonderful dialogue and seminars. I look forward to learning from all of you, and I hope to share final results of our ongoing research in October regarding the local government's implementation in the UN mechanisms. Thank you for having me, and thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
It's important, Korea.
Sorry.
I restart?
We had muted it.
Okay, sorry. Sorry, I was on mute, but I think I can be heard again. Thank you very much for your contribution. And we wish you well for the rest of your research. One of the aspects I've highlighted is that you indicated that in spite of all the ongoing work, the country lacks a human rights policy framework that could serve as an anchor for any future developments. I think that's important to bear in mind. And also the very important role of the National Human Rights Commission of Korea in moving this process further. It is sometimes not really recognized, the role of the National Human Rights Commissions. At least we don't speak of it enough, but it's a very important element in the Korean system. Thank you very much. I think we have now there's a space and the time for contributions, questions, comments from participants in place and from participants online. And I would now, so I would now give the floor to Giovanni Iannuzzi. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. The Honorable Minister. What? New President of Italy. Oh, sorry. He's the new President of Italy's NMIRF. Mr. Iannuzzi, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much for convening this meeting, for involving us in it, and I am very happy to share with you our experience as far as NMIRF. The Interministerial Committee for Human Rights, in Italian CIDU, to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, was established back in 1978 by the ministerial decree following ratification of ICCPR and ICESCR to comply with the reporting obligations enshrined in those covenants. As far as the composition, we gather representatives from basically all or almost all central administrations, authorities, the presidency of the Council of Ministers, including Department for Equal Opportunities and National Office Against Racial Discrimination, the Ministry of Interior, of Justice, Disabilities, Health, Culture, Education, University, Defense, Labor, Environment, and so forth, as well as representatives from the National Association of Italian Municipalities, the Union of Italian Provinces, the State Region Conference, the Higher Council of Judiciary, and the National Institute of Statistics. As far as our mandate, the ratification of the main UN human rights treaties has increasingly impacted on CIDU, whose work and activities have significantly increased over the years. As per mandate, mention has to be made of the preparation of contribution to UN human rights mechanism, the organization of country missions by relevant UN special procedures, as well as from Council of Europe mechanism, mainly European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance and Committee of Prevention of Torture. The elaboration of 2 national action plans on women, peace and security, and business and human rights. While we are now harnessing the first national action plan on peace and youth and security. And since the first cycle, the preparation and discussion of the follow-up of the Universal Periodic Review. Procedurally, we have developed over time practical working tools, including a mailing list of human rights focal points according to the issue to be dealt with, specific thematic grids with labor divisions to be determined in advance according to the issues to be dealt with. And we do also set up thematic working groups to gather those administrations that are most concerned with the specific exercise, such as the preparation of national periodic report, drafting a progress report, contributing to UN studies, preparing the invitations for oral discussions in Geneva, or preparing country missions to Italy by UNSP or relevant Council of Europe mechanism. As a way of example, all the administration mentioned earlier are involved in the UPR process, besides members of the parliament, though to a different extent. In terms of good practices relating to the above-mentioned modalities and relevant NMIRF principles, engagement, coordination, consultation, information, management, I would also like to stress and mention, under the third UPR cycle, as reported in the UN compilation, CEDAW was defined by the UN as an international best practice. Then, the submission of the midterm report cycle plan for the implementation of recommendations in November 2021 is also a good practice. We greatly benefited from the High Commissioner's letter received in March 2020. The High Commissioner letter, its annex, and the relevant UPR matrix allowed us to prepare with all administrations, including local and regional governments, the above-mentioned midterm report, taking into consideration the linkage between the UPR recommendations and SDGs. Its annex is entirely devoted to relevant LRG's good practices. Another good practice, information management, refers to the UNCDAW reporting guidelines and recommendation expressly requiring focus on the regional context and statistical data. In this respect, over the years, we tried to extensively report on the regional level. Moreover, on the occasion of the last oral consideration, it was in February 2024, we submitted statistical data covering each and every CDAW's article, thanks mainly to the National Institute of Statistics being one of CEDAW's members. As for the engagement and coordination, the last periodic country mission to the by the Committee on the Prevention of Torture of the Council of Europe. In this respect, we contacted and involved all relevant central and local regional governments concerned in view of bilateral meeting with the committee. Would wish to hold, and afterwards we prepared our follow-up report. In terms of additional practices, as a way of example, during COVID pandemic, CEDAW organized jointly with the National Association of Italian Municipalities a specific e-training on UN human rights machinery. Attention was paid to international human rights law and all UNHCR mechanism. As announced during our oral consideration under the fourth UPR cycle, we organized an initial training for the Italian Agency for Development and Cooperation, and a new one for local regional governments jointly with Papisca Human Rights Center will take place in November 2025. Lastly, allow me to mention that CEDAW has been progressively covering the promotion of human rights with activities, including HR education and training, as mentioned earlier on. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, and we thank you for your contribution. I think you provided us some information on the best practices for which CEDU is well known. And one of the important aspects I've highlighted is in the use of practical working tools and data collection and management tools, which I think is an important step in going forward. Most NMIRF started out of recommendations from the UPR because of increased ratifications of treaties and therefore increased burden in reporting and the consequent need to strengthen coordination and coherence. And then from there, we've moved on. Thank you very much. My next speaker is Joanne Kamouf Ward from the New York City Commission. You have the floor.
And people can just hear me?
Yes, if you speak loud.
Amazing.
Okay.
Good morning, Joanne Kamouf Ward from New York City, and I use she, her pronouns. I want to just start with a little bit of the landscape of US human rights reporting, which is definitely different than the landscape of human rights implementation. So on reporting, we have a pretty good record. But the US, as you know, like our neighbors in Canada, is a federal system. There is no national human rights institution, but there are about 150 state and local human rights commissions with their own laws that they implement and educate their residents about. So I would say historically, the federal government has had a pretty strong record on reporting to both the treaty bodies for the 4 treaties we've ratified, everyone, and as well as for the UPR. And I think some best practices that came out of US engagement with the treaty bodies, and this is with the Committee on Civil and Political Rights, was there were recommendations to the federal government to transmit the treaty body recommendations to subnational governments so that they were received by entities who were not otherwise involved in the reporting. There was also at the federal level requests from subnational actors on best practices, some of which we hear as an aspect of the NMI. I'm probably saying that acronym incorrectly. When we look at the SDGs and voluntary reporting, by my count, there are 6 cities who have done voluntary reporting out of hundreds, so that is not a very good number. If we look at the treaty body reviews, I think there are 5 cities that have ever participated directly in the treaty body reviews. The overlap between those groups is only 1, Los Angeles County. So, so we see a disconnect already. So I think my first intervention just on the question of SDGs and treaty reporting is really that I think there is a draw to the nature of the voluntary aspect of the local reviews that can never be part of what the treaty bodies are seeking because of the legal framework and the requirement that governments are complying with those treaties. So I think that is something that needs to be navigated in addition to the more specificity of treaties versus the broad nature of the SDGs. The second piece of my intervention is really a series of questions for those of you who have experience with the national mechanisms. And I think building on the intervention from our Korean colleague, I'm curious to know how much of the work is currently implementation versus reporting. As I sort of framed at the beginning, I think one is much easier than the other. And so want to hear about experiences on that and kind of how we ensure that these are really about implementation and accountability. And then I think just hearing the number of acronyms involved in the entities that are the NMIRF, sorry, including that one. And this is true in the US experience as well. They are impenetrable to a everyday person. And so really, how do we make them mechanisms that if they are not the participatory mechanism, how do they foster or ensure participation at really the community level where most of us are thinking about what human rights means. And then lastly, I think this is a perennial question that we will not solve today, but how do we ensure that we, in these reviews and reporting mechanisms, are really focusing on the bad faith actors, right? So we know the cities and the national governments that are doing the most robust reporting are the ones that want to be portrayed and seen as good faith human rights actors. In my own country, and I'm sure in every country, there are local governments that are fine with being out of compliance with human rights and may even see that as a badge of honor. So how do we encapsulate that in national reporting, right? It cannot just be the good stories because that's not a real picture of human rights. Thank you.
Thank you. Joanne, I think the questions are difficult, but that's what we're here for. And I think you've raised some, one fundamental issue is that there's a limit to voluntary reporting, since that it can fulfill a gap, but it does not address the issues as such. And therefore, I think that's something for us also to look into further. About the NMIRFs and the impenetrable nature of NMIRFs, I think you're right. The acronym is really not something that is easy. I've heard them being referred to as NMIRFs, which reminds you a little of Schtroumpfs, so it's not very clear either. So maybe national mechanisms will do it. If you speak of national mechanisms today, we all know we are referring to NMIRFs, and that might make it a little easier. Thank you.
We don't see any other requests for for interventions in the plenary right now. So maybe you want to get back to the panelists, and there will be discussions then in the breakouts that will maybe facilitate some of the discussions also.
Very well, Maria. Thank you. If there's no further requests for interventions from the floor, nor we have any online requests, so I will turn back to our panelists. Would you like to comment, contribute, to respond, question further? The floor is yours. Ian, can I start with you?
Sure. So I'll try and loop in some of the questions that have come from my colleague from New York. But I think the one thing that in my discussions with the OHCHR yesterday and discussions that we've had internally, I think the one thing that we also want to keep in mind is that a lot of the reporting that is being done, that is, trying to encompass a lot of different perspectives from different levels of government, is quite limited in terms of what can be provided based on the guidelines of the treaty bodies themselves. So I can speak specifically to the example of the UPR. So as I mentioned, we have 13 subnational governments and about 20 different federal departments that contribute to reporting. And the word limit for that report was 10,700 words. So not even including local governments, we're already at a point where we're trying to find ways to be very creative in some of our wording. We also have the added, not complication, but the added advantage, I'll say, of needing to do our reporting in 2 official UN languages, so in English and in French. And as many of you who have learned the French language know, that is there are many more words required in French, and so that further limits what we're able to do. So our English report for the UPR was actually 8,500 words. So I think it's important for us to consider in this context, including as many voices as possible and being as inclusive of all of the different levels of government, and being aware of the constraints that states and NMIRFs are under when creating lists. I'll maybe respond to one of the questions from New York that, reporting, I would say, is the more longer term established element. As you said, and implementation is really something that in our own context is being explored more and more in terms of how that can be better presented in terms of what is being done. And so finding those data sources, working more closely with our National Statistics Office has been really important. And again, has been mentioned by a number of panelists, the tie-ins with the SDGs, and trying not to duplicate requests for information. We're all working under contexts where we're doing more work with sometimes finite resources, so trying to be as efficient as possible with that.
Thank you very much. I think we now will give the floor to Esther Egobamir. She's a CEDAW expert. Mr. Ruka, I'll come back to you later.
Sure.
She's a CEDAW expert. She's the promoter of cities for CEDAW. You have the floor.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good morning, everyone. And I'm so delighted and privileged to be part of this meeting. I congratulate the organizers, and I'm really thrilled at all of the issues that I hear, which resonate with the work that we've been trying to put together at the CEDAW committee, working with stakeholders. I want to congratulate Canada in particular, because I hear that you have a system already in place with institutional, anchored within an institution. But the work that we are doing actually is to write on the 10-year experience of the Cities for CEDAW Coalition, which was established in San Francisco. I heard somebody talk about San Francisco many years ago. And at the 10th anniversary, which was last year, the results that were already generated in almost 80 cities around the US, there was an agreement to take that global. And what does that mean, taking it global? Is that we then expand a coalition, a global coalition that will help to coordinate reporting around the CEDAW articles that is directly linked to the SDGs, particularly SDG 5, SDG 11, and SDG 17. And so the experience has been quite exciting, because for us, we felt that national machineries themselves should be a key part, that we should use government as an entry point, but then have criteria for joining in. And so we have been able to engage with Nigeria as a pilot, and Nigeria has signed on, and we're trying to systematize the joining in so that the criteria, the expectations are quite clear. There are shared values, and the commitment to the Cities for CEDAW initiative is clear. And what is the Cities for CEDAW initiative? It is actually to take the CEDAW convention and operationalize it at the local level, responding to the local priorities and the local context in each locality. So it's taking the global to the local, working not only with government entities, but with city mayors, with city administrators, local government offices, and women's organizations, so that they co-create solutions to discrimination against women in different cities. So there is no list of issues that we present to any joining state. All we ask is the commitment to CEDAW, and we actually see that some non-signatories to the convention have indicated interest. The city of Taiwan, Taipei, has indicated interest. I recently was in a meeting with the Minister of Social Justice in Cardiff. They had a law and hearing of the Global Coalition. Working with the committee, we should actually be having a special edition of the coalition in Wales next year, in the first quarter of next year. And I'm also delighted that the Global Cities Hub in Geneva, Anne, is here with us. Anne is here. We've been able to put together a set of tools and guidelines, lessons from what has been implemented in other cities as a guideline. And we're working now to try and have an indicator template that would enable us to see how CEDAW is delivered in a city, because the rationale for that is that local governments and cities are actually the theater of discrimination against women, violence, exclusion. And if we would be able to join the dots and show how CEDAW can be a tool for promoting economic growth, safety and security, climate resilience, then it we would have greater engagement and reporting around the CEDAW. And one of the criteria we're building into it is the reporting, that we then find a window that when state parties do report, we will be asking questions about model cities for CEDAW and how they've been able to replicate or translate the convention into local communities within their jurisdiction. And of course, we also look at partnership with the private sector. And I think the meeting in Cardiff is one of those where we're hoping that that private sector engagement will be visible, particularly when we're dealing with digital technologies, innovation, and response to violence against women using digital platforms. And so our guideline is very simple. First, there must be local commitment. There must be national commitment and then local commitment, because in Cardiff, it's not the national government, but it's the decentralized, the devolved government. And they have identified, I think, 2 other local governments within the regional government that is committed to signing in onto CEDAW, having local edicts, having a local task force, having local reporting arrangements, and a coordinating mechanism, which feeds into the overall global coalition, which in itself is a coordinating entity that works with the CEDAW committee to ensure that we can then feed this into our periodic reporting system. We're still in the early days, and so I'm really delighted to hear all of these lessons. I'm hoping that we can work more with all of the stakeholders around the table as we take this around the world. A few other countries have indicated interest, and how do we then cascade that? In Nigeria, there are already 8 sub-regional governments who will be naming cities that will be for CEDAW, and of course following these guidelines. So how do we progress that? What results do we roll together and bring that to your table or to your group as lessons to be shared around the world? I look forward to hearing more around the table and to working with all of you to deepen the cities for CEDAW so that we have it all around the world and we have it in different regions, responding not only to CEDAW, to the SDGs, and to climate resilience and rural development. Thank you very much.
That's a good. Thank you very much. And we also are delighted to listen to you. And we look forward to how CEDAW is being carried forth into the cities, because I think that would provide also good examples for other treaty bodies to push their own treaties further down the line. Thank you so much. I will now return to Mr. Rupert and to Ms. Cho for their concluding remarks in relation to the questions we've heard. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I actually got a bit reflective on the remarks from my American colleague, because you touched upon the question of how do we include bad faith actors in national reporting? How do we deal with bad faith actors? And maybe in a way, we also have to look at the larger political context at the moment. I'm not saying it's an elephant in the room, but certainly in the US, in Europe, in Germany, we have a tendency that is actually against additional obligations on the local level, whether it's additional activities, whether it's additional reporting, we say in our Geneva bubble, probably for all the right reasons, you should do this, and we encourage you to do this. But the political tendency in many of our countries, especially including at the local level, is not favorable. And I say this because I'm also a consultant on business and human rights, and I encounter this because, for example, when you look at the supply chain laws in Europe and in Germany, we're regressing. The scope of what they cover is regressing, and that's not sort of a right-wing party that is requesting that. That's EU Commission policy, and they also have reasons to do that. I mean, it's not that far-fetched. They do this omnibus law on supply chains, as you probably have heard now, which does one thing: it reduces the scope of the supply chain laws, which also touches upon human rights, of course. So the climate is not favorable to what we're discussing here. So what I'm saying, I guess, is that we should give some consideration to the tactical aspects of how to actually, we're all happy to say you have to do this and this is good, but how to do this on the local level. And the more I listen to what's been said this morning, the more I am convinced that we need to say that there is at least a format that you are used to already, that you can sort of backpack on instead of introducing something totally new when you include yourselves in the reporting system, when you start new systematic activities, which are all good and justified. We maybe have a more impressive figure in Germany with regard to the SDG reports that are already done on the city level. Maybe somewhere other countries not the case, but we have to, it doesn't have to be SDG. We have to use innovative formats. And I'm sorry, I don't have one up my sleeve, but we have to use innovative formats in order to make this digestible on the local level. I'm sorry to put this water in our wonderful wine, but yes.
Thank you very much. Ms. Cho, would you like to make any concluding comments, please?
Yes, currently I think that a significant amount of energy is spending on preparing state reports, while actual implementation and follow-up seriously insufficient. And moreover, there is no established system for the executive branch to draft reports or the National Assembly to review them. So in our research, we are focusing on the National Assembly's role, because since the state reports submitted to the UN are not merely administrative reports, but the government ones. So that's why it is really relevant. The parliamentary committee must be involved in both the reporting and follow-up and also implementation as well. And also in our report, I have outlined the role of each key actors, including the central government, local government, National Assembly, and National Human Rights Commission and civil society within the NMIRF framework to enhance coordination and implementation of UN human rights recommendation. So it's really important to practice on this with our government, and then I hope that we will practice on this.
Thank you very much. We are on time, Maria?
No, we're not.
I'm sorry, we tried our best. We tried our best, but I don't think we're that delayed, right? Thank you very much for all your contributions. And we break immediately for the breakout group. So
yes, exactly. So maybe just to explain the next steps. Participants in the room will be broken into groups that we will facilitate in order to facilitate discussions. There will be at least one group for Spanish-speaking colleagues, so that it facilitates also this interaction. And we will have a rapporteur per group to restitute in plenary afterwards. We will resume in plenary at 12:15 to give a bit more time for breakout discussions. You have in the agenda, and the facilitators of each breakout will explain a little bit again the questions that we will try to answer in the breakout. It's really about looking at your own country and what exists, what may be the challenges in terms of coordination between the central government, the local and regional governments, but also the good practices that are out there, and maybe some concrete proposals, because we are trying indeed to be solutions oriented. Online, we will have 3 breakouts. For the moment, they are designated and they will pop in a minute at 11:30. We will have a breakout, like 3 breakouts, one for French-speaking participants, one for English-speaking participants, and one for Spanish-speaking participants, but we may reshuffle because it looks like there are a lot of English-speaking people online. We have 60 people, so we don't want to have a breakout with the 60 people online, really to facilitate discussions. So please bear with us. We decided not to have an automatic shuffling of or reshuffling of participants. So you will see on your screen, for those who are online, the breakouts appearing. please click on the breakout that you want to join. If you want to join the Spanish, per language, ES for Spanish, FR for French, and ENG for English. And we will therefore mute the plenary setting here so that we can organize ourselves as well. And I will let the facilitators, Ms. Nuzi Amamonjisoa, Ms. Rosa Sanz Delgado, and Mr. Domenico Zipoli to facilitate the plenary, the breakouts, and resume at 12:15 for the restitution. Thank you very much.
Welcome back, and I hope you have an in the room and online as we have in our breakout group. I've checked with Maria. We have 6 working groups that will be reporting, and therefore we've decided that we would give you 3 minutes each for you to highlight 1 or 2 issues that came up in your group and the corresponding practical solutions you could propose. All right, if that is agreed, I will then ask group 1 how to have agreed.
Maybe we can start with the physical participation. Maybe the Spanish-speaking group, UCLG, can report.
Sure.
Maybe, and speak loud enough for everyone. And thank you.
I'll try. Is this okay?
Yes.
Yes,
Okay,
go ahead.
good. So in our group, we were lucky enough to have both local, other subnational and national governments in the same breakout room. So we have many issues that were discussed, but also a few recommendations. Basically, we've encountered situations in regards to human rights reporting, but also general SDG reporting. That is, in many cases, there are no mechanisms for interlocution between national governments and subnational government, which has been the case for Argentina and also for Brazil. But also we had the experience of the Spanish national government, which does involve subnational governments, the autonomous communities, which are the regional governments in Spain, in its human rights reporting, but also it also engages local governments in its reporting to the SDGs. So basically, one of the main challenges that we found is that often the subnational engagement with national governments varies depending on the national government. Mechanisms that are open in 1 year can be completely deleted in the following year if the national government changes. So the main challenge is how to find this way to find a structural engagement between local, regional, and national governments. But also, one of the questions that was lying in the air during the entire conversation is, if these mechanisms for reporting disappear between local and national governments, how can we ensure that local governments still continue to report to the United Nations and still contribute their experiences and their practices on human rights, also obviously on SDGs, to the international community and to the United Nations, even in cases in which the mechanisms with the national government have disappeared. But on the positive side, we did receive the experience of Spain, which has very relatively recently, if I'm not mistaken, started to engage in a strong human rights reporting and receiving the recommendations of the United Nations and their committees in reporting on human rights. Do include subnational governments. Their reporting on the achievement of the SDGs does involve networks of local government and does involve what they call the Federation of Municipal Government of Spain. But the reality is that this isn't often the case. This varies country to country. As a network of local governments, UCLG is encountering this when we report to the United Nations. Our reporting capacity varies depending on the SDGs under review, depending on the countries under review, and we find ourselves with an unclear picture of SDG reporting, but also of human rights reporting. So basically, some of the conclusions that arose during the meeting were how to make sure that countries without reporting mechanisms can learn from other national governments in which these mechanisms exist, and how to engage in peer-to-peer exchanges between local governments, national governments, to ensure that these mechanisms are set in place, and that local governments in areas that don't have these mechanisms can benefit. But also, and more broadly, in how can we imagine a way in which local governments and the international community and the United Nations are directly engaged, regardless of the mechanisms that lie in place between local and national governments. This has been one of the main goals that we found. I think that's it.
Thank you very much.
If I'm missing anything. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I think this question that you raised about how countries can learn, maybe Maria, we could talk something about the virtual knowledge lab.
Yes.
Whenever you have a chance, maybe later, maybe we listen to them all first. So I would move on then to the second group, which was
this group?
Which was this group, which is you.
Yes, okay. Thank you so much, Virginia. Our group was fantastically active. We had representatives of, and I know it's a little bit réducteur, but we had Germany in the group, former ambassador of Germany. We had Canada, both Winnipeg and federal government, USA, New York City, Portugal through you, South African Association of Municipality, and Sweden, also Association of Municipality. It gives you an idea about who was in the group. What we had, and India as well, of course, through Milan, sorry. What we found out is that most of the countries have structures, basically, different kinds of structure. It could be through interministerial group, it could be through the national human rights institutions, but most have structure to talk about human rights more generally. So channels of communication exist, are not always used effectively, are rarely used effectively, however. But we discussed the reports that were being asked, and one of the things that came out is that local governments are being asked to do too many reports on too many issues. The main problem is that reports are being undertaken, done, drafted, but then they are kind of channeled upwards to the national level, but then local governments don't really know what's going on with those reports at the national level. So they send information, data upward, but then it disappears in a bit of a black hole, and we don't know what is being communicated to the international human rights system. So that was one of the main problems that we found. Other problem that was noted is that local and regional governments are often treated as NGOs, basically, not necessarily as part of governmental structure, and not necessarily always as duty bearers. And there was a big discussion in our discussion in our group about whether local and regional governments are duty bearers, whether they know about it, whether the federal or national central administration understands about this kind of division of labor, division of legal responsibilities, I would say. And it's not always clear who's a duty bearer for what. And I think that was one of the recommendations that came out. We need to make this clearer to local governments to what extent they are duty bearers, and maybe a training could be provided to them to clarify the competencies on that point. And let me now turn out to the solution, basically, that were discussed. The question about National Association of Cities or Regions was really underlined as being one of the stakeholders that is important to talk to for the national government, because they have the capacity to basically compile positions of different cities and regions at national level. They can also be the one representing local and regional governments, and they can also be the one basically trying to find out who could contribute to what at the international level. And therefore, again, national city networks are important and should be used a little bit more. And I think most countries worldwide have national association of cities. It was half a joke, but not only One of our participants recommended maybe a new special rapporteur on local and regional governments, you know, to focus on that and to make recommendations to states on how to better engage with their own local and regional governments. We also discussed very technical thing, but useful thing when we talked about constraints put on states to report back on their human rights situation and their limitations in terms of word that you mentioned this morning. Use appendixes. Appendix are not limited by words, you know, and therefore there you can have. Yeah, well, but then here you can provide input from your regions, from your cities, and that's what Italy has done as well in its own UPR. Use existing data to report on several issues that was definitely mentioned. And I think that's a practical way to encompass local and regional governments. You don't always need, you know, a big ministerial kind of decree decision, but sometimes going through, you know, the back door is also a solution to include local and regional governments. And then very radical, but maybe as a way to report back to the international human rights system is not through the national structures, but alternatively, you know, through other doors. And last but not least, remains the question about the incentive. What are the incentives for local and regional governments to report back to the international human rights system? That is a question that remains unanswered. And if we get good arguments on that point, I think we'll be able to also engage them a little bit more. I'm sure I forgot a lot of things, but this is what I had so far. Thank you.
Thank you, Anto. I don't think you forgot anything. Well, I just want to say that maybe this issue about the new special rapporteur is complicated this point in time, but maybe there could be also another entry point to this is if the treaty bodies would have a standalone recommendation. I know some treaty bodies already have one on the national mechanism, but perhaps push that a little further and consider including the role of NRGs in this standalone recommendation. I know it's a watered down thing, but till a special rapporteur comes, maybe that's something that we can look at. Thank you. Third working group in the room.
Third working group, we were on that side, and I will have a chance to report very quickly on this, and sorry for not being more extensive, but the questions and the discussions very much revolved around the same issues that you just said. So I think it shows that, you know, there's no, I mean, there are definitely elephants in the room, and clearly that the problems are clearly identified. We had a chance of having in our group the UNESCO Center for the Promotion of Human Rights at the local level, and since they are based in Austria, we had a chance to really look at the situation of Austria. Also, due to the presence of the South African Local Government Association in our group, we also discussed South Africa. We also had UN Habitat and two consultants who did a lot of research and work on national mechanisms for implementation, reporting, and follow-up. So they gave also their their insights on this. And also Shahrazad from Grigny municipality, and it was interesting to look at the relationship between a city like Grigny and the department, the governorate, I would say, and the central government in terms of data collection, but also the difficulties they are facing in some cooperation work that they are doing in Palestine. And it's a different relationship between an occupying power and local communities, and how you can basically get the issues brought up. How do you do that concretely? It was really, really interesting to have this spectrum. One of the key takeaways was, indeed, there's a concern for a decentralization of the process and involve LRGs. I think everyone agrees with that, even governments themselves. That's the reason also why, by creating national mechanisms for implementation, reporting, and follow-up, more and more states are looking into the membership of those national mechanisms. They've already done, some work in some regions on basically consultation with independent institutions, civil society organizations, with national human rights institutions. The local and regional government aspect is really yet to increase in that regard. Some states are indeed quite advanced. We've heard about Italy. It's not the only one, but a lot of actually states have something in place, but it's maybe not standing. That was the case, for example, of Austria. Everything is there. You have all the structures, but how do they communicate? How do you, in a way, make it more formal in order to ensure that, if there's a change in government, in change of power, things do not collapse. So that was definitely one of the key issues. And I would say solutions, training was really a key aspect. Sensitization, I think you mentioned this, Joanne, this morning as well. Things need to be vulgarized as well and simplified. The connection with the SDGs is definitely one aspect that needs to be further explored, because that's very often the entry point for LRGs. The incentive, same, how to move from this narrative on formal obligations or even willingness for the voluntary reviews to something that is more engaging and that really strengthens the capacity, the skills and knowledge, but also provide more resources, because indeed, often LRGs do not get involved because they just don't have the capacity to report and to be involved everywhere. So that's also one thing. And of course, the international human rights system for the moment does not really enable this direct participation. And the digital aspect of things is important as well, and can be a way to break some of the silos. The National Recommendations Tracking Database is one, but there are other digital tracking platforms. Also at the CDs level. So there are also cross initiatives, between CDs that enable this collaboration. So something maybe to look at.
Would you like to speak at the virtual chat now?
So maybe just to say that OHCHR is launching in September a virtual hub for national mechanisms for implementation, reporting, and follow-up. The idea is to have all the information that we're discussing today, that we've discussed in past fora, good practices, challenges faced by the different countries, fitting in one space, one digital space, so that we can all, look into that. There can be guidance on how to engage with the international human rights system, how to implement recommendations from the different perspectives. So you will hear more on that in the months to come. But peer-to-peer learning is at the center of our work, and that's why we are here also today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. We move on down to the online breakout groups.
So we have 3 breakout groups. The 3 actually were English-speaking breakouts. I see Domenico, you're ready to intervene. So maybe since you are like very prominent, you actually want to see you. So please go ahead, Domenico.
Yes, thank you, colleagues. Greetings from room 123, floor 1. No, jokes aside, thank you so much, and I'm pleased to report back from breakout group 1, where we focused on how to better integrate local and regional governments into international human rights reporting processes. So we really looked at the reporting part of the discussion. We had a strong and diverse group of contributors, strong presence of US-based local and regional governments such as Pittsburgh, LA County, civil society platforms, also US-based, including the Human Rights Cities Alliance, and as well as UN agencies, including UN Habitat's office in Saudi Arabia. Just like I've learned from other groups, discussion was rich in practical examples, challenges, forward-looking recommendations. I'm not going to go into detail, but I can assure you I will do so in writing. However, I would like to highlight, I would say, 4 main points that came out of the discussion. So firstly, in terms of structures and institutional realities, our colleagues in the group highlighted that there is indeed a variety of NMIRF structures ranging from institutionalized national mechanisms to more informal or ministry-led processes. And in some contexts, what we know per definition as NMIRF functions are undertaken by national human rights commissions or specific ministries, though often with limited alignment to Paris principles and weak engagement with local governments. The second very interesting point was on the question of LRG selection and addressing disparities. So a recurring theme in the first part of the discussion was on how to identify and select local and regional governments for participation in national reporting. And it was suggested that this should not be arbitrary. And practical suggestion was instead for this election to be informed by existing disparities in rights realization, for instance, between urban centers and rural areas. And UN Habitat here emphasized the value of using this urban-rural typologies and socioeconomic data to ensure that the most relevant and underrepresented local contexts are brought into the national reporting cycles. The fourth, and this came out quite strongly, is the role of civil society as coordinator and enabler. And civil society platforms in this sense playing a crucial role in enabling local and regional governments' engagement. So where institutional mechanisms are weak or absent, we've seen, especially in the US, that civil society has stepped in to build awareness, offer training, and even coordinate joint or shadow submissions to international mechanisms. And so here I would say something to underline is that civil society platforms are essential in supporting co-governance approaches that align local authorities with broader community priorities. And lastly, this was quite interesting. I thought original, but then I heard from Marie-Ève that a similar point was mentioned in your group, and that is the concept of framing, or in other words, also incentivizing and building a human rights culture within local and regional governments. Participants in our group stressed the importance of framing human rights in locally resonant terms, basically highlighting the fact that local and regional governments are indeed already working on human rights issues. It's just that they are not branded as such, so to speak, such as equity, inclusion, community well-being. And many local jurisdictions are already acting, as I said, in line with human rights standards, even if not using that terminology. So something to work on here, and maybe reflect on whether the strategy might be best placed to continue with this way of dealing with human rights issues, yet in a locally resonant framing, or to undergo awareness raising and human rights education for the opposite. And the discussion emphasized the need to build a human rights culture within local institutions, which is already being done by institutions like IORA in the US. And the last point within this conversation was to explore how human rights engagement can be incentivized. For example, by increasing access to international partnerships, investment opportunities, or indeed global recognition. So in a nutshell, our group emphasized the importance of structured coordination, data-informed LRG selection, civil society LRG partnerships, and strategic incentives to meaningfully embed LRGs in national human rights reporting frameworks. I hope I was, I followed what our colleagues said, but of course I have everything written down for future written reporting.
Thank you, Dom. We move on to the last group. I think it was Nusi who was facilitating the group. Nusi, can you come in now?
Yes, thanks, Virginia. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So in our group, we had Nigeria, Italy, and Mexico, and so countries that have an NMIRF and some that don't have. What came up from the discussion is that the issue of ensuring contribution of LRG into reporting and implementation processes has to be incremental. So we wouldn't achieve, let's say, significant changes overnight. And for some countries, it's taken years for local and regional governments to contribute in these processes. And for the time being, they're voluntary, which means that there's no systematic contribution from LRG. What came out of discussions also is that there are conditions that can be put into place to facilitate that contributions of LRGs, or at least to ensure that the realities of let's say, the local situations are reflected in reports. So first of all, this is what I think has been mentioned by the three other groups, is the membership of the NMIRFs. The fact that Association of Local Governments or Municipalities is part of the NMIRF facilitates this contribution. Also, the National Statistic Offices being part of the NMIRF facilitate the representation of information on the situations in regions and municipalities in reports of the countries. And a member of our group also mentioned the importance of representation by security, which is not necessarily one, let's say, entity that we would think about when we look at these memberships of NMIRFs. So information on local and regional realities are collected also. So in addition to the National Statistics Office, they're also collected through the implementation of sectoral plans. So we talk about the sectoral plans of trafficking, labor exploitation, in which local and regional governments are already involved in. And they're also collected, and sometimes at the time of the preparation of reports, let's say, to CEDAW, through, let's say, the role of sectoral leads. So let's say Ministry of Gender that collects information from the subnational entities that they're the counterpart of that ministry in subnational entities. Let me just go back to the NSO before I forget it. Hence here the importance of NSOs to be able to produce statistical data that is disaggregated by region and, let's say, municipalities, so the different levels of the government. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to, let's say, produce information that reflects these realities. And the next, let's say, condition, and it's been mentioned a couple of times, is the importance of human rights education and awareness at the local and regional government, and how the issues or the challenges that they're facing on a daily basis can be read as human rights challenges. And similar to that, I think the question of local incentives, finding entry points that make human rights issues relevant to the local context. And in Nigeria, this is already been done on issues relating to sexual, genital, and reproductive health, education, rural housing, and transportation. Something that came up also in the conversation is the role of faith actors. They are neither local nor regional governments, but if we want to bring about changes, let's say in terms of women's rights, then it's important also to involve these actors. Maybe the two last point, it was proposed also as a good practice to use the documents that are published by treaty bodies as guide for local actors. So this includes let's say, the guidelines of treaty bodies, but also general comments. And I think that Virginia, maybe instead of proposing the creation of a mandate of special rapporteur on the LRG, maybe we can propose a joint statement or a joint general comments by the treaty bodies on LRG. And of course, the last let's say, element or options for participation of local and regional government is the direct engagement with of subnational entities with international systems. So I'll stop here. Thank you, and back to you.
Thank you, Lucy. Yes, point taken. Joint statement, yes. Standalone recommendation, yes. There are lots of entry points, and I think we have enough material for the next steps and for the organizers to take into account not only the discussions but also the written contributions from some of the groups. I thank you all. I think we've all deserved a good lunch, and I hope to see you back in the afternoon.
So we will resume at 2 p.m. Geneva time. Thank you for being on time in the afternoon as well. In the afternoon, we will focus the discussions more on implementation, role of local and regional governments in that regard. But all these things are completely linked, so it will be like an overall discussion. Thank you so much, and see you at 2 p.m. Good afternoon. Welcome to the afternoon session of the event on local and regional governments and how national mechanisms for implementation, reporting, and follow-up can help foster this engagement. If that's the case, that's what we really want to look into. Maybe some ground rules before we start the plenary discussion of this afternoon. So the plenary sessions of today's meeting will be held in English only. I'm repeating this because some participants this afternoon, we are in different time zones. You will have received information on how to activate caption translation through WebEx. And of course, we are sorry for not being able to provide interpretation in other languages. As you know, the UN Secretariat is facing an acute liquidity crisis, and as mitigation measure, at least the breakout sessions will be organized for language, English, French, and Spanish. For participants attending in person, I think I don't need to repeat that there is a very, I would say, sensitive microphone system, and therefore background noises need to be mitigated as well. So it's really important that anyway, for smooth meeting, we listen to each other. If you need to take the floor online, you can raise your hand, or you can use the chat option to also state your or explain your questions or your comments. And of course, for those who are in person, please, this morning it was a little bit difficult to see everyone. So if you want to take the floor, don't hesitate, but maybe just raise it first like that, and then leave your nameplates in the vertical position so that we can really identify your request for the floor. So without further ado, I give the floor to Ms. Antu Duong, co-director of the Global Cities Hub, who will moderate this afternoon's panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie-Ève. Very glad to be back with you. For those who were not here this morning, we discussed reporting and in the sense that to what extent can NMIRFs or NMIRFs or national mechanism on implementation, reporting and follow-up help local and regional governments better engage in relation to reporting to the international human rights system. This afternoon is devoted to the implementation of those same recommendations stemming from the UN system, or implementation of human rights more generally, I would say. In particular, we will also have a look at, again, national mechanism, I'll say, and to what extent they can go beyond coordination of reporting, but can also help coordinate the implementation on the ground by local and regional governments. I think it's important here to emphasize the cycle aspect of the various stages we're talking about. Of course, we talk about reporting and implementation, but there's also planning, monitoring. Everything is, of course, interlinked and very close to each other. So I think when we talk about implementation, it's important that we do not see this as a standalone dimension of the human rights cycle, but again, linked to all the different stages. And in the same vein as we need to connect the different stages of the human rights cycle, I think we also need, of course, to connect the various levels of government we're talking about. We had a bit of a discussion this morning in our working group on the question of whether local and regional governments should be considered as full-fledged duty bearer of human rights. Some participants here took a very strong stand saying, of course, local and regional governments are duty bearers. And I think there should be more clarification, more training about what that implies for local and regional governments on the ground. And probably this issue will somehow come up this afternoon. But without further ado, let me turn now to my fantastic panelists. Two of them are here. There's one online as well. We will start with Emilio Jaton. You are the Secretary of Human Rights of the Governorate of, so it's a province, I guess, of Santa Fe. In Argentina, you're also a former mayor, so you know all the levels, basically. which is great. Yesterday, you mentioned that there were serious problems of human rights in Argentina. I think we're all aware of the change of government that occurred a while ago. Even though Argentina has ratified all the core human rights treaties a few decades ago. I think it would be great to better understand about the situation in Argentina in spite of the current situation, despite the current difficulties. To what extent you, as a representative of a region, as a former mayor, are involved in the implementation of human rights, whether you know about all the recommendations that stem from the UN system, or you basically implement human rights in a kind of a separate channel than that those recommendations coming from you. You have the floor, Emilio.
Thank you. I understand your question. En verdad, vinimos...
And maybe, sorry. Maybe you will speak in Spanish.
Spanish and
there will be consecutive interpretation by a kind colleague from UCLG. So go ahead in Spanish and then we'll understand what you're saying. Thank you.
Okay. Vinimos a hablar sobre cómo mejorar la presentación de los informes nacionales y la implementación de los derechos humanos mediante la participación coordinada a nivel local y regional. A eso vinimos, ¿no?
We came here to discuss about the implementation of human rights, not just at the local level, but also in coordination with the national level, and how can local governments better implement human rights.
Pero los quiero volver un poco atrás en el tiempo, porque si no existiera un condicionamiento, implementar sería imposible.
I would like to go a little back in time, because without the context and without the conditioning, implementation would be impossible.
Los derechos humanos son garantías universales, pero los gobiernos locales están sujetos a coyunturas políticas, y eso está pasando en Latinoamérica.
Human rights are universal guarantees, but local and regional governments are subject to political context, and this is what's happening right now in Latin America.
Pero nosotros lo tenemos muy claro, los derechos humanos no son negociables.
But we have it very clear, human rights are not negotiable.
Por eso es fundamental fortalecer las herramientas legales y garantizar protección, difundir, promocionar, gestionar y promocionar.
So this is why we want to protect, promote, invest, and grow the outreach of human rights in our city.
Es muy difícil gestionar los derechos humanos en Argentina y en Latinoamérica cuando el gobierno nacional, el gobierno supergobierno, no entiende o no quiere y quiere discutir la base de los derechos humanos.
It's very difficult to implement human rights in Argentina and in other spaces in Latin America with a national government that doesn't understand or doesn't want to understand the reach of human rights.
Sin un mínimo de concordia y afecto entre los ciudadanos, ni las leyes ni las instituciones pueden sostenerse.
Without affection between communities and between cities, not the institutions nor the laws can be upheld.
En el medio aparecen los prejuicios, que son construcciones dinámicas que no pueden explicarse como parte de la naturaleza humana.
In the midst of it all, we have prejudices which cannot be explained as human nature, but rather as a human construction.
Sino como impulsos innatos de agresión hacia el otro, sino que están en el núcleo de las relaciones del poder existente en la sociedad de Argentina.
And these prejudices, which are symptoms of aggression to one another, are currently in the middle of the current situation in Argentina.
Hoy están haciendo el discurso del odio.
Today, they are doing a discourse of hate.
Que es en sí mismo un ataque a la tolerancia, a la inclusión, a la diversidad y la esencia misma de nuestras normas y principios de los derechos humanos.
This discourse is an attack to diversity, an attack to democracy, and it's an attack ultimately to the very foundations of human rights.
Socava la cohesión social, erosiona los valores compartidos. En los últimos 80 años el mundo ha visto discursos de odio como precursores de crímenes atroces.
These discourses undermine human relations, they undermine our own understanding, and in the last 80 years since the adoption of of the Human Rights Charter, we are seeing the proliferation of hate speech and how this has been the justification of crimes.
¿Pero qué hacemos con esto?
So what do we do about this?
Hay una propuesta que es muy antigua que deriva la amistad cívica.
There's a proposal, which is a very old one, which discusses civic friendship.
La amistad cívica no anula los desacuerdos, pero los sitúa en un marco de respeto y mutua consideración.
This civic friendship does not annul disagreement, but rather it reframes them in a context of mutual understanding.
Eso nos permite la deliberación racional y evita la disolución del vínculo político.
This allows for rational deliberation and prevents the dissolution of the political understanding.
Así, la política no es solo una lucha de poder, sino también una práctica compartida que requiere lazos, afectos y moralidad.
That way, politics is not just a struggle for power, but rather a shared understanding of the reality that we live in.
Esta amistad cívica es el vínculo de las ciudades que genera confianza, sentido de pertenencia y cooperación entre los ciudadanos.
This civic friendship is a link between cities that generates understanding, it generates cohesion, and it generates better relations between citizens and communities.
Pero esa relación, que yo decía al principio, no está rota en todos los sentidos.
This relation that I was talking about before isn't broken in every sense.
Estamos intentando conformar regiones en la República Argentina para así lograr mesas permanentes de derechos humanos y los delitos que más nos impactan.
We are building in Argentina, we are working to build regions of human rights to ensure that there is a framework of understanding in a moment in which.
Desde la Secretaría de Derechos Humanos de la provincia de Santa Fe entendemos que garantizar derechos requiere políticas públicas estructurales, sostenidas y articuladas.
From the Secretariat of Human Rights of the province of Santa Fe, we understand that guaranteeing human rights needs structural public policy that is sustained and articulated.
Por eso impulsamos iniciativas con proyección interinstitucional y también regional.
This is why we're boosting initiatives with interinstitutional and regional outreach.
Se presentó un proyecto de ley para establecer la capacitación obligatoria en derechos humanos para todo el personal de la administración pública provincial de los 3 poderes del Estado.
First, we developed a capacity building initiative to ensure that the workers of the 3 administrations of the state had sufficient understanding in human rights.
Este proyecto busca institucionalizar un piso común de formación, sensibilización y responsabilidad estatal.
This project seeks to institutionalize a common ground of capacity, understanding, and state responsibility.
Ya hemos capacitado más de 10.000 empleados públicos en materia de trata y explotación de personas.
Our capacity building initiatives have reached over 10,000 people in issues such as exploitation and treaty of people.
Además, estamos organizando la primera jornada regional de lucha contra la trata de 3 provincias argentinas para más de 10 millones de personas.
We are also working to establish the first day of struggle against treaty of people, trafficking people, sorry, which join the provinces of Santa Fe, Córdoba, and Entre Ríos.
Las 3 provincias acordamos coordinar acciones conjuntas de prevención, detección, asistencia y persecución penal, incluyendo instancias de formación, campañas de sensibilización y mecanismos de derivación. Estamos conformando el observatorio regional.
These 3 provinces agreed to coordinate joint actions of prevention, early detection, assistance, and prosecution, including also capacity building, campaigns of sensitization, and also mechanisms of early attention. We are conforming a regional observatory.
Este tipo de iniciativas muestran cómo una visión local y regional pueden generar impactos estructurales, cómo se articula con compromiso político y enfoque de derechos.
These types of initiatives show how a local and regional vision can generate structural impacts when it's articulated through political commitment and a rights-based approach.
Pero el problema lo tenemos cuando miramos hacia arriba.
The problem is when we look up.
Cuando miramos el gobierno central,
when we look at the central government.
Allí hay una negatividad en cuanto a la visión de los derechos humanos. Se pone en discusión la historia de derechos humanos de un país.
They have a negative approach to human rights, and they're even questioning the history of human rights in an entire country.
Por eso necesitamos hacerles un gran pedido.
This is why we need to ask you a huge favor.
Necesitamos de ustedes.
We need from you.
Necesitamos saber cómo podemos implementar estos mecanismos de presentación de informes y seguimientos. Necesitamos acuerdos de colaboración para elaborar monitoreos. Necesitamos saber cómo hicieron ustedes para llegar a este momento del presente. Nosotros todavía estamos en el pasado.
We need collaboration agreements between the tiers of government. We need to know and we need to learn from each other and from you, from the United Nations, to see how to face the future, because we are still in the past.
Sabemos que los derechos humanos son fruto de las luchas.
We know that human rights stem from struggle.
Y las luchas las vamos a llevar a cabo día a día, pero lo queremos hacer junto a ustedes. Muchas gracias.
And we want to have this struggle with you every day. Thank you.
Muchas gracias a usted. And I think that's the whole purpose of having those kinds of meetings with different cities, regions, states as well.
Situation.
Exactly, different situations. I think it's very interesting that you mentioned this example of trafficking and the work that 3 provinces are doing in Argentina, and basically how the international system here could link up with that, you know, to provide you with assistance, with help. And if you have academia as well, if you have a national government which does not seem to collaborate, you know, then linking up with the international system is also part of the solution, actually. So that you hear from others, you get technical assistance, you know more about the international standard, what's out there, basically. I think that's an important point that you're making. Thank you so much for that. Let me now turn to my second fantastic panelist. We've heard Carola Gunnarsson yesterday, but not everyone was here yesterday. Carola, you are the Vice President of the Swedish Association of Local Authorities in Regions. So it's basically the National City Regions Network, I would call it. You have many other titles. You used to be Mayor, Lord Mayor, I understand, from the city of Sala in Sweden, and also a Vice President with UCLG Europe. Is that it? Sweden is a very active member of the international human rights system. It has ratified almost all core human rights treaties, not all of them. It has also, I've seen very recently, set up a national human rights institution. So that would be also maybe interesting for us to know what is your relationship with the national human rights institution here. And yesterday you mentioned that policy without funding is poetry. You know, funding is definitely a challenge when it comes to the engagement of local and regional governments with the international human rights system. This morning you mentioned that your basically cities in Sweden, regions in Sweden do too many reporting, but sometimes these reports get lost at the national level, or at least you don't know what's going on with them. So is the national government more inclusive when it comes to implementation? Do you get more information about UN recommendations, UN human rights recommendation, and then are you involved in the implementation through the national structure, national mechanism you have in Sweden? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And let me start by giving some backgrounds about Sweden. When we talk about human rights work in Sweden, it is characterized by strong legal protections, an active civil society, a general political consensus on the importance of safeguarding these rights. But at the same time, there are challenges and there are also criticisms. Today, despite legislation, discrimination persists and even racism. And we also have a huge discussion about the indigenous people in Sweden, the Samis, about their rights, right to land, language, and self-determination. We also have a criticism today about the asylum and migration policy, because the laws has been tightened now since the 2015 refugee crisis. And of course, an ongoing issue is violence against women and girls in close relationships and honor-based violence. And we also have discussions and criticism about the rights for people with disabilities, because they still face barriers in society, particularly when talking about accessing to work, education, and housing. Of course, there are a lot of ongoing efforts from the national level. We have now national action plans for human rights. We have, as you mentioned, Chair, a new national human rights institution established in 2022. And of course, there are also a huge activity around education and awareness, because human rights are included in the school curriculum and civic education. We have a very strong local self-government in Sweden, and it's also in the institution, in the constitution. Municipalities and regions in Sweden, they play a very important role in the practical implementation of human rights, since many rights are realized at the local and regional level. And when we look upon the responsibilities for municipalities and regions, we can see that municipalities and regions are responsible for social service and care, for education and preschool, healthcare, public health, culture and recreation, and reception and integration of newcomers. And all these responsibilities are, of course, related in one or another way to human rights. There is a lot of work ongoing on the local level when it comes to human rights in practice. But we also today have a lot of challenges and even gaps on the local level. We have an uneven application. It varies widely to what extent the municipalities and regions actively work with human rights. There is a lack of knowledge. Not all local authorities have sufficient competence or tools to apply a right-based approach. There are limitations on resources, as I mentioned yesterday. Budget pressure on social services and care can undermine these ongoing right protections. And we have limited follow-up, I would like to say, even if we have talked a lot about reporting and different systems. But I think that there still lacks a system to monitor how well human rights are integrated into policies and services. When it comes to the national level, Sweden has developed a multi-level national mechanism for the implementation, reporting and follow-up of its human rights obligations in line with the UN recommendations. And this system, it includes 5 components. It's an independent national human rights institute, an interministerial coordination group within the government offices, a system of regular international reporting and dialogue, independent follow-up and auditing mechanisms, and structured participation of civil society throughout the process. This multi-level structure ensures that Sweden fulfills its international obligation while maintaining transparency, accountability, and collaboration across levels of government and with civil society. Since municipalities and regions are responsible for many services that directly affect human rights, as I mentioned before, their role is crucial. And the Swedish government acknowledged this both in UN reporting and national strategies. But SALAR, the Swedish Association of Local Authorities and Regions, are not the formal part of the interministerial working group at the government's office. But as the government says, their input is considered in Sweden's reporting to UN mechanism. They contribute to implementation and follow-up. And SALAR have tools and knowledge that are used as a foundation for local human rights efforts. But this is the official version. But how is it in reality? If I read the UN reviews, then I can read that UN treaty bodies have consistently emphasized the importance of strengthening the local level engagement in human rights work. Sweden often refers to SALAR role as a support actor when reporting to these bodies. So yes, the Swedish Association of Local Authorities and Regions play a key role in Sweden's system for human rights. But from our side, we underline that SALAR and the local and regional government must be recognized as part of the governmental system in Sweden. Although all our duties, as I have mentioned now, the government refer to us and treat us as NGOs. And that isn't okay, because we are part of the governmental system in Sweden. And as I said, it's in the constitution, the local self-government in Sweden, with all our duties. Because the local and regional governments in Sweden, we follow our citizens from they are born until they pass away. And we are responsible for them during their whole life. So we need a change in Sweden, and we need to underline the importance of the local level. And we need to convince the national government that they need to take into account the work that is done by the local level. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Carola. Can I quickly follow up and ask you a question? What would a recognition look like? You know, you say we need to be recognized as such by the central government, because it seems that on paper everything is working pretty well, but in fact, you know, there are challenges, and I think that's the case for all countries worldwide. So what would it look like? What does that mean? We want to be recognized as such and not as an NGO?
Let me give one example. Now we have been discussing a lot about Beijing Plus 30. What is on the agenda now about gender equality? When I listen to the national reportings, when I listen to the national governments who present their work when it comes to gender equality, I was here in Geneva and listened to all the European countries who presented their work with the action plan following up the Beijing Plus 30. Only one country said anything about the local level. All the other European countries talked only about what they did on the national level. Nobody, except one country, mentioned the local level. And all of us who are sitting here know that the work is done on the local level. So I think that one first step would be to recognize the work that is done by the local level, to talk about the work that is done on the local level, because that gives courage to the local level to go on with their work. And secondly, that would also help sharing experiences and get new ideas from each other if also the national level mentioned the local level and focused also on what happens on the local level. So there is such a lot of things to gain if you as a national government also highlight the work that is done by the local level.
Thank you. And I think it somehow responds to the question that was raised this morning by the city of New York about incentives for engaging with the international human rights system. And one of them is definitely getting recognition by the national government about the work you're doing and the challenges you're also facing at local. Thank you so much for that. We're moving on with our third and last panelist who's online. Jackie Smith, are you here with us? Yes, Jackie, you're here. Fantastic. Good morning. It's
Good
still
morning.
early for you.
Yeah, pretty early.
Jackie, you are, sorry, I'm looking at my notes. Jackie, you are the co-founder and chair of the steering committee of Pittsburgh, Human Rights City Alliance, and of the North American Human Rights Cities Alliance. So two hats you are wearing, and you've been working in Pittsburgh, in the city of Pittsburgh in the US, working towards the realization of your city's council proclamation of declaring Pittsburgh a human rights city. That was back in 2011, so this a few years ago. So you'll tell us about how it goes. I think you've been very involved in different reporting of US human rights at the UN level, including for CERD, this Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and the UPR. And I think you are, if I'm not mistaken, currently working on the UPR, the Universal Periodic Review of the US, which is supposed to take place in November this year. But of course, you know, we'll question whether the US will participate to that UPR. But it's a very peculiar situation with the US because there are not that many treaties that have been ratified, but you still are active on reporting on what you can, basically. So tell us a little bit more about your work in terms of human rights reporting to the UN, and to what extent that works well, you know, at local level and the federal level. To what extent there's good communication on that side. Jackie, floor is yours.
Thank you. And are you able to share those slides that I shared, or shall I do that?
Do you have them? Remember? Oh, if you have them, just share them. It's easier, Jackie. Otherwise, I can send them to you. If you have them, just share them, Jackie.
Okay, I'm working on that. Did that work?
There's one here. No, that doesn't work yet, but go on and I'll
Okay.
send the slides.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
So just to start, actually, I may be able to. No. The context in the U.S. is very difficult, as you know, and we don't have a national human rights institution in the U.S., which makes this kind of work even more difficult, especially at the local level. The other complication is the discourse, public discourse in the United States is, and knowledge of human rights is very limited. And so, so the starting ground is perhaps more challenging than, well, a lot more challenging than Sweden, although I think there's some similarities in what our needs are and what ultimately we need to do, which is bring human rights principles into governance. And so I think what I want to emphasize is how important the role of civil society is in this work, and to show what we've been learning by trying to bring human rights home, as we say. I work with the Human Rights City Alliance. My work is as a volunteer, and my job is as a professor of sociology, so I study this stuff as well, and thankfully get to think about it a lot. But I think a key point is that this work is underfunded, like all human rights governance, but recognizing the important role that civil society can play with governments is really key, because what our movement of the human rights cities, I think, is about is building human rights constituencies and capacities at the local level through education, getting folks active in lobbying local and other government officials on their human rights obligations and our expectations that they enforce them, and in monitoring. So this is a really key role in government that is really largely on the back of volunteers, and more support for civil society as part of human rights governance, I think, is really a key lesson from our work. And there's talk in grassroots movements for various kinds of rights, a lot of economic, social rights, of the need for co-governance between movements like ours and local agencies. And we see this very much in our work. In Pittsburgh, we work very closely with the local Human Rights Commission, and we find that we're really helpful in helping them learn about international obligations, and helping them also widen their public presence and strengthen their capacities as a human rights enforcement agency. And we can increase their leverage vis-a-vis other government, other elements of government, the mayor's office and the council, and help them get the funding they need, for instance, and get their recommendations adopted by other branches of government, but also to help with regard to the business sector. And municipalities have really weak obligations overall in the United States to regulate businesses. And this has been a real challenge for municipal enforcement of human rights. So one of my colleagues in our movement likes to remind us that we need to be the enforcers of human rights. Civil society is really a critical piece of human rights implementation. And so, thinking about the need for people to demand their rights and demand that governments are held accountable and this is reflected in our slogan, human rights don't trickle down, they rise up. And that's really it draws from the famous quote by Frederick Douglass, the abolitionist activist, and who said that power doesn't cede control without a demand. So it's really key that we think about civil society role in this piece, about thinking about human rights governance and the architecture. So this next slide shows the model that we use in our work to think about what we're doing and how we can strategize. And we call this the sandwich strategy, by which we help engage local communities and mobilize their interest and knowledge around the UN human rights mechanisms, and create opportunities for them to be engaged in these processes, while also working to make sure that our local government officials know about their obligations and know what's in these reports that pertains to their work. This often it's a lot of public education. It also requires some translation to, read the reports that come out and distill them into small doses that can be easily absorbed by policymakers and the public. We do a lot of community forums and other events to help popularize human rights in the larger population, but also get these messages to public officials. And that can be through going to city council meetings, through our work, of course, with the local commissions, but it also could be, going to the planning commissions and the zoning boards to make sure that human rights principles are brought into those conversations. And so we're working to kind of train volunteers to be part of those conversations and speak human rights in all these places. This is part of changing the human rights culture, or building a human rights culture, and then changing the policy scripts so that human rights and people's needs are put ahead of this idea that if we take care of business, human rights will trickle down. So our slogan becomes pertinent to keeping people thinking about our strategy. So building this local constituency, and then we can engage with the UN mechanisms like we're using the UPR to help residents look at our local human rights record and then learn about the laws that pertain. And it's interesting to see what happens when you show people the texts of international reports and treaties that guarantee rights that are clearly not part of the conversation in the United States. And so engaging folks in these conversations and building reports to the UPR and the treaty review processes is a great way to educate people about their rights and government responsibilities. What I also like about the UN mechanisms and these reporting structures is that they force us to engage in conversations about recommendations and to find examples of where good practices have worked to improve rights. So we're not just complaining, but we're trying to be part of the solution. And then once we have these recommendations, it's a great tool that we have then to go and demand that these recommendations be implemented at the local level, whatever that looks like. So translating, the changes at the national level that can help us improve conditions locally. So we're working with global allies then to help. Actually, next week we go to, or later this week, we go to Washington, D.C. with some folks to lobby around our UPR recommendations to meet with embassy representatives to try to help these governments focus on some of the key issues in our communities and urge their governments to press the U.S. Government on this. And we'll be preparing for whatever contingency with how the Trump administration treats this review, and I think things are lining up for making sure that there's at least a shadow UPR. And so this is building the grassroots support that can put pressure on governments both at the local level and national level for the changes we need. Then finally, can you just go to the last slide? I'll just quickly go through how the sandwich strategy works on the ground and thinking about our UPR mobilization. So we do community forums and get folks engaged in writing stakeholder submissions to the UPR. And all of these contribute to bringing human rights thinking, changing policy narratives. And we found that they're also really helpful for building coalitions locally across different issues and across cities. And when we can point to, what our partners in other cities are doing for the UPR, it really does help people feel like they're part of a much bigger movement and encourages this volunteer engagement in a process that, especially at times like these, can bring hope that we can change things. And I think the other part of it is we've been able to involve our local commission in this process and helping think about how these will translate. So just engaging local governments and residents together, we can prepare the ground for trying to implement the recommendations that come out of that. I'll just close by saying that I think the cross-city connections that we have in our Human Rights Cities movement has been really valuable to helping identify some of the big structural matters that impact cities across the whole country and identify how they're linked with human rights obligations and the kinds of changes at the national level that can help all of our cities. So that's helpful for the governance and bringing local perspectives together. So I'll close there. Thank you for the opportunity to share.
You could not hear it, Jackie, but people were clapping in the room. So thank you so much for that. I think it's a great reminder about the role of civil society. We talked this morning about, of course, national mechanism, also national human rights institution, their role in supporting local and regional governments to engage at the international level, but little has been said about the role of civil society. And I think it's very useful that you remind us that indeed, civil society can also put pressure on their own local governments to make sure that they take account of UN recommendation in relation to human rights. So thanks a lot for that. Super useful. We have a few minutes for questions, comments, reactions, both online and in the room. If you want to, please raise your name plate so that we can see you. Are there any comments, reaction? Yes, Sherry, from the city of Britain.
Well, first of all, Jackie Smith, it's such a pleasure to be able to see you in person. I've only, as you know, talked to you on the phone and admired your work from afar. So what a thrill. I'm here with my North American counterpart from the Bronx, Joanne.
Brooklyn.
So I just wanted what did she say? Brooklyn. I apologize.
Very important. I'll explain to your geography
Diplomatic
later.
incident, Jackie Smith. Order. You know, my colleague from Argentina, and I can't see him right now. I want to make meaningful eye contact. There you are. My contact from Argentina, and I'm not sure if you were able to hear the presentation, Jackie, but the parting lines and was to share and be collaborative. And I was hoping you could respond to that because your last slide contains the importance of translocal strategic action. And I just want to take this opportunity to thank my colleague from Argentina from the bottom of my heart from sharing the full range of emotion today, but also to tie it with your last slide. So that is sort of my intervention there, Jackie and Madame la Présidente.
Thank you. Thank you, Sherry. We'll be happy to share the presentation of Jackie with you, Emilio, but also with all other participants to make better use of that sandwich strategy that has been put forward. Milun, do you want to intervene?
Yeah. Hi, Jackie. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, Jackie. This is Milun Kothari. I just wanted to ask you about the amazing work you're doing. If the US doesn't show up for the UPR, that doesn't stop your work, right? I think you made a very important point that the international human rights standards, the mechanisms have given you a context to do quite a lot of human rights education at your community level and to have these cross-city alliances and all that. I think it's a very important point because we are here focused on ensuring that everything goes up to the UN. But the point I want to make, which you very eloquently stated, is that even if that doesn't happen, the human rights work at the local level continues, right? Using the same instrument. Just a comment.
Jackie, you want to respond?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, this is really a motivation that we've had in building our alliance, is that we've recognized that there's these great reports coming out of the United Nations that really reinforce the points that our movements are working around and give us legitimacy. And we tell folks, you know, we're leaving an important tool in the toolbox that we have. And so people are getting this metaphor that we can really look to the UN for new tools to make change where clearly the national system, our legal system, is completely corrupted, and there are no remedies to realize our human rights. And you know, especially now as people are losing their rights, they're scrambling to try to find some tools. So it's an opportunity for us. I wish we had more capacity, because it really is hard to build the kind of cooperative ties, even among our advocates. You know, it's always very difficult to help people work together. and find ways to work through struggle, because we're living in a system that isn't designed for human rights, and it isn't designed to help people work together to solve problems. So the UN tools have been a real kind of focal point to help people overcome some of their local differences and understand how the issues connect and how our communities connect across one another through these principles.
Thank you, Jackie. And I think you mentioned the word legitimacy. I think it's very important as well. You said that the UN recommendations or work provides you with the legitimacy, basically, to implement, human rights on the ground. Probably you don't need the UN, but it makes it stronger. And it also helps you, of course, hold your government accountable. And I guess all levels of government, both local, regional, but also federal governments, even if, communication is not always that easy. Are there any other comments? Otherwise, we'll start breaking out in groups. Are there any, Robert, from UN Habitat?
Yeah, just a very brief one. I mean, the observation on the role of the UN, for the role of the UN, I'm partly a historian by training as well as a lawyer, so I tend to go back far too far with things, but I always go back to a speech that Hammarskjöld gave in 1954 in San Francisco. So the US colleagues, you can take some credit there. But I think some of the things that he talks about there are as valid for the situation of local and regional governments as they were then for what he was thinking of in terms of newly independent states and different things like that. So they were talking about the main advantages of working with the UN, one being a source of impartial and objective advice and suggestions, which I think is certainly very valid in the case of local and regional governments. And that also links into the question of being able to connect with other local and regional governments. Now, I know the UN isn't the only way of doing that, but it's one that has, for all the warts and everything else that go with it, you at least know what the mechanism is and you know where it's coming from and what's driving it. And I think the other thing is the peer review element. As we know in all situations, and that plays, as people have highlighted today, not just cities comparing with each other and saying, I want to be doing better than I am because I don't want to be shown up in a meeting with them. But it is also that leverage with national government, because national government, even some of the most difficult ones, don't like to show up in a room and not have anything to say that anybody will be impressed by. So that's leverage that you can use, and forums are fairly unique in providing that opportunity. So I think sticking to those and working with them, and also being aware that it's not always the UN as the passive actor in this of being used by local and national governments for these purposes. We also very actively use all of you as partners, because when I'm working with one country or one city, if I'm able to say to them, well, why don't you talk to these guys? That's a very useful tool in my armory, because it isn't about what I think and what I'm trying to persuade you to. I'm opening up another world to you. So I think there's quite a lot that can still be done there that sticks with what the traditional objectives. Thank you.
Yes, Carola, thank you. Yes, but as Jackie said, the crux of the matter also remains the question of capacity and resources to be able to engage, basically, and to follow up those meetings, to engage with the UN, so that's not always easy. But
then is a streamlining and effectiveness measure. There are, of course, we all have capacity constraints. We all have a lack of resources. I can think of one or two countries I deal with who don't seem to have those constraints, but one or two, and that's about it. That is always the case. The question is, how do you make the most out of what you've got?
Yeah.
And for example, with the UPR situation, there's quite a lot that you can do around that, particularly where the national government isn't ideally cooperative, say. And that isn't just pointing at the US. There are many situations where you don't get the national government putting across. But if we have, for example, a lot of cities doing voluntary local reviews, well, why aren't we building that more closely aligned with what we want to do with the UPR, with what we want to do with human rights standards,
there's a lot of overlaps there. We can save resources on some of these things. And there are a number of different opportunities, I think, around that we can use.
Thank you. I note Carola, is there Joanne as well? You wanted to take the floor? Okay, Carola and then Joanne.
Thank you. During these days, there have been a lot of discussions about cooperation among local level, cooperation among municipalities and cities. And I would like to highlight the importance of the national associations, because I think that the national associations of local authorities and regions in all the countries around the world are a platform where municipalities and cities can come together, share experiences, learn of each other. The national associations of local authorities and regions can also be the one who is the link to the national government, because sometimes the national government says that we don't know which city we should talk to. So instead of taking one city, they don't talk at anybody. So I think that the national associations can play a very crucial role as a link also between the local level and the government, and also help the government to find these good examples. Finally, I would like to say that today we have talked a lot about how to report and how to report to the United Nations. I would like to ask for another thing, and that is it's time now for United Nations to give the local level a place at the decision-making table, because we have talked about that for so many years now. And now I think it's time also for United Nations to take a step forward and recognize the importance of the local level. Thank you.
Yes, I would say yes. But it's not just the UN are states. And we tend to forget it, asking the UN to do things when basically it's member states who decide. And, you know, they basically created the UN and are the one who can open the doors.
My son is pessimist.
Joanne, please, from New York City.
Yes.
And then we close it.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, okay.
No.
Okay. We're having a civic discourse. But just to call back to history, I think when we're talking about human rights and the role of the United Nations in the United States, you know, it was advocates went to this system and helped create this system because the government wasn't listening, right? Racial discrimination was considered to be fine by the national government. And so the NAACP, which is one of our longest standing civil rights organizations, filed a document called An Appeal to the World. And it was, our government is not listening. We need everyone else to listen. And I feel like even listening to Sweden talk and report back on what European governments are saying, most US advocates cannot come to Geneva and hear what all the governments are saying. That in and of itself is super helpful, right? So if there's a mechanism to report back what our own governments are saying or not about what local governments are doing, that gives the Human Rights City Alliance, other umbrella organizations that we've been talking about, kind of the real talk of what's happening in the spaces where most people cannot get. So just, I think the solidarity call to action, again, picking up from yesterday, we can all play a role, whether or not we have the seat at the table, of telling what the people with seats at the table are saying, and giving us the ability to then shadow report in an official way or otherwise. So thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. And last,
my son, and this Ron is pessimist, but is really sorry.
I don't want to close on the pessimistic. Say thank you so much. We'll close the panel at this point. I think it was very useful to hear, you know, your different experiences in Argentina, in Sweden, in the US, very different contexts, not always easy political times, and you're very exposed as local governments, basically, to what's going on at the national level in your country. And therefore, it's great to have local and regional governments, and I haven't heard it so much, but as the pillars of stability. somehow as well, and defending democratic principles at your own local level. We'll close it there, and I guess we're moving to working groups, this time focused on implementation. And I'll let you explain how we move forward. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you very much. Indeed, as for this morning, the in-person attendance will split into groups, one Spanish-speaking group and then two English-speaking groups. That will be facilitated, one by UCLG, the Spanish-speaking group, one by Patrick Marega, who's somewhere here, and he will facilitate this discussion here, and Martin Brown on the other side. And once we resume, they will be the rapporteurs, and we will have 3 online breakouts in principle, 1 Spanish-speaking and 2 English-speaking. You will see them appear in WebEx, and you need to join. You will not be automatically moved to breakout. You will need to join, and I will be facilitating one. Domenico Zipoli, whom you see now, will be facilitating another English-speaking breakout, and Rosa Sanz, who you see here now appearing, will facilitate the Spanish-speaking breakout. And we will then, so now it's 15:05, and we will resume. We will have 15 minutes more to give a buffer. So at 15:45, we will resume here for the the takeouts and takeaways from each group, ably moderated by Antu as well. And then we will come to the conclusion of this event. Thank you very much, and we'll see each other soon in the breakout. Let me just join one of the rooms. Thank you.
Thank you. So we had 5 working groups this afternoon to discuss the issue of implementation and how local and regional governments are involved in a way in implementation of human rights, recommendations coming from the UN system or implementation of human rights. We all know that local and regional governments are crucial factors in human rights in any case. Let me ask our facilitators. We had one Spanish-speaking working group, and all the others were in English, if I'm not mistaken. And we'll start with Martin. Are you?
Yes.
Yeah, Martin, you're here.
Hi.
If you could tell us, about the findings in your group. Would you mind coming here?
Yeah, okay. Yes, well, we had a great group in the end, and not all men, thanks to those who joined us a little bit later. So we had a diversity of thought and opinion and experience. On the first question, we noted that there wasn't any sort of systematic contribution and involvement of local and regional governments in implementing recommendations, but we came up with the examples that we were aware of, particularly the devolved regions in the UK, Scotland in particular, want to implement directly treaty body recommendations and facing some challenges there. Morocco and certain engagements from sort of county levels in Kenya, other places in implementing recommendations on human rights budgeting. So there is practice, and maybe practice in each individual country, but it's not systematic, and there's very few places where that is recorded. But that's something that could be helped. Looking at the challenges. I mean, the challenges we've put a lot of also in the morning session. Don't want to go around the paths of resource constraints and skill constraints and knowledge levels again. There's an imbalance also in terms of the role of local governments in different countries. Some are trusted, some are not trusted, some are part of the standard policy implementation sphere in countries, but not always. And then coming to concrete proposals to enhance local and regional government's contribution to implementation, we had a good debate about to the extent to which local and regional governments should participate in UN human rights mechanisms, particularly being part of the formal review or not, the extent to which they should be encouraged to submit shadow reports, shadow briefings. And one idea developed that particularly where there is an issue in one sector, getting the experts in that sector from different local authorities to work together on submitting a joint report using data they might already have. Might be a way to sort of encourage an expansion of that, supplementing the work done by civil society, associations and business councils. In a similar way, we can get local authority experts in planning, or housing, or water to cooperate with briefing the treaty bodies. That could then lead to more direct specific recommendations on local authority, what the state's obligations will be. Specifically, the state retains the obligation to make sure the local authority has the resources to implement certain recommendations and measures. And then some question about how much sort of responsibility local authorities would have in the international legal sphere, their legal personality. But I can phrase it, wasn't universally agreed, but if we want local authorities to take UN human rights mechanisms seriously, UN human rights mechanisms need to take local authorities seriously. And so, but that requires a lot more information, it requires a lot more time, and we don't want a situation where there are 32 Swiss cantons in a room being reviewed individually. We don't want to change the system to that extent. But certainly there are ways to expand within the current framework.
Thank you so much, Martin. I think it was you went over the 3 questions very diligently. Thank you for that. It facilitates my work basically. Thank you. Let's move directly to the next. We had Patrick. Patrick, where are you? You're here.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. We also had a very rich discussion here, and we had a representative from Canada, US, and India, representative of local government alliances, and actors that experience directly on the ground the challenges and the opportunities of implementation. We try to look at these 3 main questions and come up with some answers and proposals. Now, when it comes to the current involvement of local and regional government in implementing the recommendation, we saw that LRG plays a central role in translating international legal framework into local realities through the policies and the activities they are already doing. It's something to keep in mind because we identify a lot of lack of understanding of the role and how local and regional governments should position themselves vis-a-vis the legalistic and wording of recommendations. So there's a lot of already done on the ground, and the government should be responsible to facilitate that process. And LRG help also identify gaps in implementation at the local level and offer important data for accurate reporting. We talked about the role of academic and NGOs to support LRGs, including in clustering recommendation that can make recommendation more digestible and relevant for local realities. There is a lot of need to make the recommendation process lighter and relevant for local governments. Some municipalities have implemented tools like child rights, impact checklist, and that's also a good way to go on other issues like environment, race, gender assessments, preparing tools that ease the work of local representative and organizations on the ground. We said that the implementation isn't always it's never a linear process, and LRG contributes, even if they are not formally tasks, to the implementation process. Local governments need alliances to implement. We look at the role of LRG as a voice, as a key voice in reporting that should be amplified and valued. Challenges are many, and the lack of understanding of federal structure sometimes is an issue. Many member states don't fully grasp how the centralized system function, and there are also often constitutional and legal complexities that tend to complicate the concept of LRGs. So local components often risk to remain without a voice at the expense of other entities at the federal and provincial level, for example, having more space de maneuver. Complex and fragmented recommendation, we discussed that the challenge and the need for clustering, limited resources, it always come up. Not all countries have a national mechanism, and I think the OHCHR tracking database is not always used and could provide also in helping clustering, for example, and easing the work at the local level. Overall, national governments are not fully integrated, not integrating local input. So despite structure to consult, actual integration and reflection in national report remain weak. And concrete proposal, develop simple, practical tools, create localized tools like checklists, we said that, and without the need to interpret complex international documents. We need to vulgarize and make the process simple and accessible. Enhance recommendation clustering, we said leverage academic NGO partnership, and institutionalize local consultation mechanism.
Thank you. Need for simplicity, I think, was underlined throughout this working group, that it's very complex and that we need some people to cluster, to help digest all those recommendations, so at least local governments can understand them, actually, which is not always an easy task. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Let me move to Jose. You had the Spanish-speaking group.
Yeah, so basically many of the things that I will share have already been shared, and many of them we've heard them this morning because the challenges are common to all local governments, I have to say. So the realities that the group shared with us in the breakout session is that local governments, as Secretary Emilio Hatton was saying before, are already working to implement human rights on the ground. They are often doing it without the necessary powers, and they're often finding ingenious ways such as peer-to-peer learning, such as working between local and regional governments in instances where there is no support from national governments in order to bring to life the recommendations from the international human rights. There are obviously some cases in which the connections between national and local governments are different and are more integrated, such as we've had the case of Spain, which has developed mechanisms to involve regional government in observatories on the accomplishment of human rights and violence against women, which is a positive example of this. But in general, and going to the challenges, local governments are often facing the same issue, which is lack of funding, lack of trust from national governments. And sometimes they're lucky to just not be trusted. In other cases, they are simply ignored, the communication is broken, or simply the measures are top down. And in other countries, unfortunately, the national government does not hold human rights in high regard. So it's also that. Regardless of these challenges, which we've heard this morning, the positive examples that we've heard from Spain, but also from Brazil, which has a Ministry of Human Rights, but it has a Ministry of Human Rights, and there is coordination between the Secretary of Sao Paulo and the Ministry of Human Rights in some instances. They are working to reignite a cooperation between the ministry, which was founded in 2010, if I'm not mistaken, but has not, due to changes in national governments, has not always been a strong ally to local governments. But there is an understanding to work together and to find common ways to finance the achievement of human rights on the ground. And there was also the issue, which I forgot, so sorry, of data. There's an issue of local governments accessing data and accessing recommendations from the international system, which are often passed to national governments in international meetings, but often do not reach the local level. And often local governments have challenges identifying which frameworks to follow and how to implement them on the ground. But the challenges in data goes both ways. The data produced from local governments on the situation of human rights on the ground are often produced, and even when produced, they often don't reach the national level. And certainly if they don't reach the national level, they don't reach the international level. So in ways to build on this and find concrete proposals to build on to achieve human rights on the ground, it's listening to local governments and ensuring a way that the data produced from local governments on the ground reaches the international sphere. We discussed this morning the importance of subnational reporting to the SDGs. So we imagine how to build an analogous system to SDG reporting when it comes to human rights and what this can look like. But there is also the issue that often and as Special Envoy of UCLG Carola Gunnarsson just recently said, we are often not in the spaces in which local governments need to be. We can interlocutor with the international system. We can come to Geneva. We can go to New York. We can go to Nairobi. But there isn't a necessary follow-up. We need that these mechanisms are solidified, are recurring, and have a concrete follow-up to local government. So these are just some of the issues that were raised in the breakout group, some of which as UCLG we also stand behind, but just basically this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I really note the last point that you made about this mechanism and making sure that it's not only about hop in, hop out, but that there's kind of a sustained dialogue, which is not happening. And it's not happening on many other issues as well. It's not only local and regional governments, but it's always difficult to ensure that sustained engagement. I also note this question of the lack of trust and the relationship that plays between local and national governments that is absolutely fundamental to ensure that there is consultation and coordination at the national level. Thank you so much for that. Let's move on to both you and Domenico. Domenico, you're online.
Thank you. Thank you, Antu. Very well. So our group, which I was very happy to see was very similar to the mornings, discussed quite extensively a number of questions that were pertaining to that first discussion, which is the issue of data collection. But this is directly, of course, directly related also to implementation measures, because of course, no data, no possible action. So I hope you'll forgive me for a bit of a focus on this aspect. So the first point is that locally anchored data is critical. This is the first message.
Can you repeat? Sorry,
locally anchored data.
Locally anchored data is critical. So a key message from our participants was that national and federal level human rights data often fails to capture the full picture of rights violations on the ground. For instance, data collected solely through law enforcement channels, for instance, misses underreported or unreported incidents, especially from marginalized groups. And so this is where local and regional governments come in. LA County, for instance, gave an example of a community-based alternative data collection system that includes civil society and victims themselves. And these initiatives not only broaden the scope of reporting, but as you mentioned earlier, before giving the floor to me, it enhances legitimacy and trust. Yeah. Linked to this, the idea that disaggregated and narrative data require investment. So we discussed the importance of disaggregated data by race, gender, age, location. This is something that LRGs can do, and that often federal level or national level data collection might find difficult to do. But then this implies significant resource demands. And it is here that this level of data work requires dedicated staffing, technical tools, sustained funding, resources that many LRGs lack, but perhaps CSO platforms can come in and help out. So this is the second. The third is that this gap might indeed be solved by the use of digital tools. We had a representative, the founder of Impact open source software in the group, and it really showcased how tracking tools such as Impact OSS can facilitate multi-level collaboration. And if we were to enable LRGs to contribute data directly into national platforms, this could help bridge this evident divide between local experience and national international reporting. This was quite evident in the discussion. Then the fourth, direct pathways for LRG engagement needed. So while some participants noted the potential for LRGs to channel data through NMIRFs, there was also some that would pointed to political and institutional constraints that could limit the inclusion of LRG information into national reports. So there was an interest in thinking about establishing direct pathways for LRGs to share data with the UN system. The role of NHRIs was mentioned also. We haven't really mentioned NHRIs a lot today, but NHRIs can be an ally in bridge building, especially those with provincial offices. Civil society actors also emphasize their role in surfacing structural issues, such as austerity policies and corporate capture, which are often politically sensitive, and civil society platforms could have a role in this. Lastly, an interesting concept, the need for political and legal imagination. In essence, to envision new institutional arrangements that would support human rights implementation at the local level. So the importance of creating flexible, inclusive, and future-oriented systems that empower local actors to drive innovation and co-govern, reimagining how rights are realized in practice. So not, fixing with the status quo, but thinking about the bigger picture. I would stop there, maybe just to underscore that what we discussed. So inclusive, disaggregated, and community-driven data collection is not just a technical issue, but a political and institutional one. Investment in digital tools, enabling direct LRG engagement, and fostering collaboration between civil society and NHRIs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Domenico, for that solutions-oriented working group. I really like the fact that you mentioned you've mentioned it several times, but I think it's really important that we talk about the digital tools as a practical way to have local and regional governments engage in UN human rights tracking, or human rights, system. It's getting a foot in the door through the back door, but basically, not waiting for a ministerial decree to have a kind of a all-inclusive, all-encompassing NMIRFs or NMIRF, but it's really kind of doing it practically. What do we need for that reporting? Okay, we need a digital platform. This is how I can contribute, and that's a very, again, pragmatic way to do it. And maybe that is not so political, and therefore a little bit less, less scary for states willing to engage their local and regional governments. Thanks for that. Go to the last group, not the least one, Marie-Ève.
Thank you very much. So our group was also online. We were a very small group. Actually, the discussions revolved again a lot about also the importance of digital tracking tools as a way to foster collaboration. But maybe just to say that in our group, we discussed the case of Mexico, Scotland as part of the UK, and Argentina. But from the government perspective, we had 2 representatives of the government in our group. So maybe just to say first that one of the issues that was discussed indeed was the fact that the international human rights system outcomes are not always easy to digest for non-human rights lawyers, I would say, and therefore difficult indeed to digest at the local and regional levels. And as you said, very often, and actually in a lot of cases, human rights work is being done on a daily basis at the local level, but without having always this understanding on human rights, and therefore the need maybe to continue disseminating. And here it doesn't mean that it's the UN that needs to do that. Actually, it's all actors, how to increase human rights education, dissemination, but also using the tools of today. I think someone mentioned this, was it this morning or I think it was yesterday, Joanne mentioning that human rights are not sexy. And therefore on TikTok, on other social media, it's easier to just put people against each other than really talk about a positive narrative. And this is really missing, and that's maybe something that human rights activists should be more active in doing. And human rights mechanisms recommendations are not easy to digest. So what can be done by all these actors to make it digestible and to foster implementation? So that was one key aspect discussed. Of course, I think it's something that we touched upon, but not in depth today. So for me, this is really a key takeaway for the future, if I may say. It's this issue of federal government structures. We talked about LRG's participation, but in a broader sense. But there are some specificities related to federal governments indeed. And we've seen that in the example of also the other devolved systems like the UK. The UK, for example, they do participate in reviews in Geneva. They are all represented and they come in dialogues. On implementation, they are doing things, but they don't have a coordination mechanism, and it is lacking. And they perceive the digital tracking, a digital tracking system as a potential solution. For the moment in the UK, it's the National Human Rights Institution that does that. It's the Human Rights Tracker, but there's no such thing as a digital tracking tool for the UK, and this would definitely facilitate, collaboration and tracking. On Argentina, maybe just to say, because I really want also to bring this, it's important to the table here. It's that what the Argentinian government mentioned there was, in some ways similar to what Ian mentioned this morning, which is also the structural challenges that hinder the full and timely fulfillment of, the full, I would say, implication of all the actors, because of indeed the shared competence, basically also between federated states and the federal government, and how all of this unfolds, both in terms of reporting and then in terms of implementation. And indeed, the duty to report to the international human rights system in a timely manner, and the ability or the difficulty sometimes to gather the information, to be able to promptly, present something that really represents the diversity of the situation in the country. So I just also wanted to bring that back, and that was basically from our group. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marie-Ève. It's been a very, very rich discussion. I'm trying to note down everything. We'll have to digest all of that. But I think we have a few more minutes just to make some closing remarks. Do you want me?
So I will, normally Domenico Zipoli should come back. He was online, but actually he's in the building. Once he's back, so we will, Domenico, can you come down?
No.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
It's me. Okay. I had used another technology, to communicate with you, but it didn't work out. And also UCLG for the closing, please. So we need. We are very, as you see, we do several things at the same time, right?
Until they come, can we make one or two comments?
Yes, of course.
We bridge the gap. I have
Colleagues, please, we're just taking a few comments.
I have two comments with regard to the discussion this morning and this afternoon. The first one is, it occurred to me that for developing a positive narrative, positive narrative for competences of the local governments in human rights, we might also use the decentralization narrative and the subsidiarity narrative. As you know, in the EU, it is a rule that whatever can be done on the local level should be done on the local level. It's not voluntarily, but it should be done. So maybe we can use that narrative, which is in place in the EU in many countries. The other thing I wanted to mention, and that's maybe a sort of a caveat, when we talked a lot also in the working group about a direct representation of LRGs in the UN system, etc. I think there is a lot, speaks for that. However, I think when you come to the accountability issue, and lawyers might make more of that, where a national government is responsible for the treaties they sign. It's not a mayor, it's not a regional government, it's the national government. And you might have a tendency that would blur that accountability if you have sort of a new representation. I don't know how to solve this, but I just want to add this caveat.
And it's a debate, huh?
Sure.
The question of the duty bearer is a debate.
The duty bearer,
exactly. I don't think it's completely solved, and therefore there's material to discuss there. Any other comment before we go to the closing part? I think it's been 2 long days, and maybe you want to go home as well.
Adrian has it.
Adrian, short, please.
I am Adrian Seller from Geneva Human Rights.
You need to speak out a little bit, please.
And our organization is working a lot on the implementation issue, helping NGOs and all kind of actors to obtain something from the UN bodies, but to translate it for the regions and for the local. And I have in this connection, we have been working on specific country programs, in particular in Mexico, but I was already involved in the diagnostic on all the national program of action, and then in Botswana and in Nepal and in other countries. What was very interesting to see is that when there is need, the central governments everywhere are using the local authorities. So it is not a matter of whether or not the type of things, and what is missing is indeed the translation from this international language to the local realities. And as a training organization, what we did was first to do the same as we did with NGOs when we give courses in the regions. So with local authorities, listen first to what they are doing, trying to see that, to show to them that it is human rights, and then linking this with the mechanism, and then speaking about the Human Rights Council, and not before. So, second remark is that in the current discussion about the reforming UN80 and so on, it is critical to keep the aim, the priority of really implementation in the region. And what we see in the current plans we have been listening to is that decentralization is mixed up with local authorities. When we create all kinds of offices everywhere in the world, the aim of each office should be to work not only with the local government, the national government, but also with the with the local authorities. And this is something which is highly missing in the policy of the Office of the High Commissioner. From the very beginning I'm here, I have seen this totally missing. And so the actor, the local authorities as actor, becomes gradually involved in the making of the implementation and then will be one day recognized. There is, in my view, no doubt that a status is needed in the UN. How the status will be done, I don't know, but it will be done by participating more and more actively in all the mechanisms, in particular in the field of implementation.
Thank you, Adrienne. Thank you so much for that. We always value the participation of civil society in all those meetings. Let me now come to the closing part. We're all here, all the co-organizers of this meeting. Very difficult to close. I've noted down a few points that I'd like to share with you that I took away after 2 days of intense discussions. Of course, there's an issue in the sense that the international system is not really providing formal entry points for local and regional governments. And I think that's what gathers us here. You know, how do we find those entry points? How do we work on them to make them become a reality? As I said, the UN remains a state-based, state-led organization and will need their help, their support in order to break through, if I may say. So let's never forget about this, that the UN is not an independent entity and it's relying on states, and that we need to work with them in order to create those entry points. I think it's been also said several times, it was your point, Virginia, but I really take this away with me. It's not a question of political setup. This event was really focused on federal structures, devolved entities, but it's not really about this, to be completely honest, even though they have specificities. It's a question of whether the federal, the national level, central administration recognizes local and regional governments as partners, as implementers, as duty bearers, basically. It boils down to that, more than the structure, the political structure of the state, although that political structure may, of course, help in some instances better engaging with local and regional governments. Basically, more regional governments than local governments in most countries. So the issue of recognition, the issue of trust is very central. What is your relationship as cities and region with the national administration determines how basically you can engage at the international system. Some states will be willing to let you interact directly with the international human rights system, others won't, you know. So how can we still be in touch with the international human rights system is a question there. The issue of incentives, again, what are the incentives for local and regional governments to engage? We know from the international human rights system why we want to engage more with local and regional governments, because we get more accurate information, we get a clearer picture about what's going on the ground. But the other way around, why do they engage? What benefit they get from engaging with the international human rights system is not so strong, is not so clear. So there's a question of legitimacy that the UN can bring to local and regional governments to justify their action on the ground. There's a question of accountability. As city and region, you can hold your own government to account on its own international commitments, but we need to work on that narrative in order to get more local and regional governments engaging with the UN human rights system. The NMIRF, the NMIRF, is of course the ideal vehicle. We've heard it. It has very different structures, format in different countries, but it of course relies on the willingness of the state to get, an inclusive membership, to get local and regional governments within, its processes, within its work. What has been discussed today, but also yesterday, is the role of other actors who can support that engagement. And their national human rights institution, very strong in some countries, can help Civil society, definitely, you've heard it with the US National City Association, very strong actors as well as the academia that can provide that neutral space for research. And two more points. Again, I've said it earlier, there's practical ways that exist, you know, to embed local and regional governments into the international human rights system. You know, again, those digital tools are one of them. Let's be pragmatic. Let's work together. Let's make sure that we have data locally collected and then, you know, used as an input into the international human rights system. That can be through that, or, you know, again, the big door is a political decision from the top, making sure that we do include the regional governments. So both ways, I think, are mutually reinforcing and need to be used by local and regional governments and the UN. And finally, to finish, I think although there are many challenges that remain, you know, in different contexts, 10 years ago, I'm not sure we could have had this discussion. So things have moved forward. Definitely. I was part of the system already 10 years ago, had never heard about local and regional governments or cities or regions. And now we can feel, you know, there's a bit of a change. So I have a selection bias because of the mandate of my organization I work with, of course. But I feel that things are changing and that we need more allies, more partners to work on those human rights. And therefore, I really kind of am enthusiastic, optimistic about the fact that we will get there. It might take a number of years, of decades, but we'll get there. Thank you. Now, let me give the floor, now that I'm done, to Domenico.
Thank you, Antu. After this list of conclusions and follow-up actions, there's not much I can add, to be honest. But again, risking to repeat some of the things, maybe I'll focus on some of the things that were mentioned during our takeaway, our group exchanges, which I thought, by the way, was a great way to structure this meeting. And thank you very much, Maria, for taking the onus really on organizing this wonderful day with so many great experts. So what I can say, so broadly speaking, is that that today's exchange confirmed the local and regional governments are indispensable actors in the human rights ecosystem and a potential great ally for NMIRF institutionalization. It's early days for the NMIRF space, and I think we're in the right moment historically to include local and regional governments in NMIRF discussions in the coming months. LRG proximity to communities allow for richer, more inclusive data, often capturing realities that NMIRFs do cannot gather. And we've heard how community-based reporting, disaggregated and narrative data, importantly, as well as the use of digital tools, can bridge the gap between local implementation and global monitoring. So this, I think, should be brought to the broader NMIRF discussions, including the different Human Rights Council resolutions that are specific to this. One other thing I'd like to highlight is the need to create incentives for human rights engagement. This was mentioned quite a bit today, I think, the word incentive. From recognition and visibility to practical tools and resourcing, ensuring that LRGs see the added value in aligning with the international mechanisms. So really to try and come up with some, without making things up, but showcasing how LRGs can see the added value really in engaging with the mechanisms. And finally, stronger pathways for direct LRG participation. Training for LRG representatives is something that I'd like also to point out on the international human rights mechanisms procedure and entry points, really trying to underline where LRGs can enter the mechanism with their data, but also with their implementation and positive narratives, as we've heard today from our colleagues in the US. Collaboration with NHRIs and civil society is a must. We need to think also of how to engage all of this into the NMIRF discussion.
And what I really liked from that last group is the fresh thinking about institutional models, seen as critical to advancing locally rooted yet globally connected human rights system. And us at the Geneva Human Rights Platform would be very happy and proud to support this venture. Thank you very much for all of you, and especially for the online colleagues. We've bonded quite a bit with our colleagues in California. It's been an early day for you, or a late evening, I don't know how to read that, but thanks a lot for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Domenico. Now let me turn to Jose Alvarez. You're the head of the outreach, but we've seen you the whole day at UCLG. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Andu. And since you've seen me all day, I'll try to be brief. Andu and Domenico have made it easy for me because I don't think I can add a lot more to what you've already said. But first of all, thank you to the Office of the High Commissioner, thank you to the Geneva Human Rights Platform and to the Global Cities Hub for co-organizing this session and for having us. It's been a pleasure. It's been great to interact with all of you. I want to start by saying that local governments are already willing to engage with the international system. These 2 days that we've had here, the interlocution with the Office of the High Commissioner and the work that we are doing in multilateral spaces, not just in the human rights regards, but also at the high-level political forum on localizing the SDGs, in the climate summit at the COPs, etc., is a testament that we already see ourselves as partners of the international system, and that we are, and some of the cases that we've heard here about the challenges of implementing human rights at the local level make it all the more clear that the international system needs to engage with local and regional governments as well as with other stakeholders such as academia, as we're seeing, such as the civil society organizations, in a different manner to the way that we are doing it now. And this is basically our core. Now, local and regional governments have taken this to heart. We are working already as UCLG, but also as the entire constituency of local and regional governments to secure spaces of interlocution with the international system. So to secure spaces like we had yesterday in Geneva, here in Geneva and today, but also in spaces in New York, in spaces in Nairobi at the Habitat Assembly, and the next COP in Berlin. These are meetings in which local governments want to be, not just for the sake of being there, but to call for a stronger acknowledgement as actors with a political agenda and as partners for transformation, as I was saying before. We've talked about lack of data, and local governments are already producing data. We are producing, and not just producing data for the sake of understanding what's happening in our cities, but producing voluntary local and voluntary subnational reviews to the high-level political forum as a political tool to identify ourselves as actors for transformation. And this is basically our goal and our challenge. And Sue was saying that perhaps in 10 years, perhaps in 20 years, but the process has already been going for a long time. It started even before the adoption of the SDGs. You can see it with the local governments that have been called into this meeting yesterday and today. So this is a long-standing process, and the partnership that we want with the international system isn't here yet, but it will. We were mentioning it, and you also mentioned right now, the role of local governments as GT bearers. And with regards to human rights, our organization, the constituency of local governments, has understood this, and we have understood that direct interlocution with the Office of the High Commissioner and direct interlocution with the international system can also be a tool for local governments to understand how to implement human rights, to learn from each other, and also to create direct bridges from the information and the frameworks that are generated here in Geneva, but also in New York, and to implement them from the bottom up without necessarily having to go through national governments and identifying different ways in which to engage with the international system beyond national government. And this all goes back to trust. In a moment in which communities are often mistrusting the United Nations, in a moment in which we've said before, the word human rights isn't sexy, it doesn't carry the weight that it's often used to. And in a moment in which human rights violations are in many cases the norm, and we hear them in the news like we're watching the weather, local governments here today and here yesterday are bringing to the attention of everyone that human rights have importance from the bottom up, that human rights are our agenda and they are inseparable from all of the other agendas that local governments have. And this is what I wanted to leave you today. We want a stronger engagement with the multilateral sphere. And this isn't to overcome national governments, but it is to identify ourselves as the true partners that we are. So thank you again for the opportunity, and thank you everyone for being here these days.
Thank you, Jose. And last but not least, Marielle, I think you've been the linchpin of all this meeting, so you deserve a big clap.
Thank you very much. I would like to really warmly thank all of you for being here today, in person, online as well. I must say that this is also very much related to our ability, all of us, to build partnerships with my colleagues from the Geneva Human Rights Platform, Global Cities Hub, UCLG, but more actually even internally within our office, different, I would say segments of our office that work sometimes on different issues, LRGs on the one hand. We, as the capacity building program, our main mandate is to support states' engagement with the UN human rights system, UN human rights mechanisms. But actually, to be very honest, we cannot strengthen the engagement of states without strengthening the engagement of other stakeholders. And that's the reason why in our capacity building endeavors in all the regional offices, I'd like to acknowledge the fact that a number of my colleagues stayed sometimes late. Some are based in Fiji, some in Panama or in Santiago de Chile. They were also online to listen and to participate in breakouts in some cases. And really our work is also to train civil society organizations, national human rights institutions, and actually we are very happy to foster or strengthen our discussions with local and regional governments as well, indeed, as duty bearers. But it's just to say that there are several, I would say, angles to it. There's the official, I would say, forum where member states represented by their governments take the floor in dialogues, in reviews, and then you have all the technical cooperation that we do on the ground and here today as well. And in that, in these other spaces, we really try to foster peer-to-peer learning. That's why we really wanted, all of you to have a space and not us to dictate or to give some, to preach, I would say, because we are not a better place for that. So it's really to give a space, and I'm happy that today was moment of this kind, and it's not the only one, and it will not be the last one. So that's I think one of the key takeaways. I will not repeat everything that my colleagues say because I would say I agree with most of the things that were said today. But maybe to say as well that there's no one size fits all, and therefore let's really always try to be not general in our assumptions and in what we say, but really be context specific. There are from my experience, I've seen big and important human rights activists in governments, in civil servants that I've been in contact with, and it's important to acknowledge that. It's really about human beings dealing with human beings and being and a lot of those colleagues, civil servants in governments, also feel isolated within their governments. Let's not forget about this. So we are happy to be those conveners at OHCHR and have those spaces. And of course, the linkages with between human rights and SDGs is key. Digital tracking tools for me, remains really one avenue to go, and building on existing structures. Let's try to build on what exists and get the most out of this. And we would like to, invite you, of course, for the next Human Rights Council session. It's in September here in Geneva, and there will be a lot of events on national mechanisms and how they can be a platform to engage with other stakeholders. We know that there's also an important side event by a Brazilian CSO platform on how CSOs can engage with the Universal Periodic Review. So there are a number of things that will be done during that session, including the launch of our hub So I hope that many of you can come to Geneva, and otherwise we will have many other opportunities of this kind. Maybe as next steps, there will be, of course, the recording and the participants list communicated to you very soon. And then I would say later we will have a report of this meeting that will be also shared with you. Thank you very much. And in the list of participants, we will also include emails. So unless you communicate to us, otherwise your email addresses will also be there, because that's also about communities of practices. So thank you very much, and thank you to all those who were also online on behalf of the High Commissioner of Human Rights. We close this meeting and see you again very soon.